And there's a model of it in the Smithsonian Museum in Washington. Later on, in the 1960s, he headed the HOTOL program. You may have heard of them, I don't know. But there we are. There was the radar, millimeter radar system. The idea was that they were going to fly this and pick up the signature of tanks and be able to actually identify them. British Aerospace wasn't the only company working on this. There was another company called Marconi in the UK and several companies in the United States. And they all got together and compared data. Well, they tried to, they couldn't. There was something wrong. All the data that they'd collected on tanks all seemed to be different. So my job was to go through the data analysis that we'd collected and try to put it into some form that could, and then collect other people's data and match it. So that's what I did. I spent some time doing it, but eventually I came up with a method and we could then investigate everybody's data and check it all out. So that's what I did. After I'd finished doing that, I had to work on several other things, which I can't mention really. But anyway, I went to the boss and said, you know, we've worked all this, spent all this money on stealth. Maybe somebody clever is looking at using the gravitational signature of something. I mean, you can see a ship, a battleship, using it with gravity at 3 miles. Okay, an aeroplane's a bit more difficult, but as we'll see towards the end, the MOD have come up with some ways to look at signatures, and McDonnell Douglas back in 1991 were also trying that system. So we knew it was possible. So I said to the boss, you know, can we, well, can I go and check this out? He said, yes, if you think it's worth it, you do that. Next slide, please. So the first thing I did is I went to talk to a professor at Imperial College in London, who back in 1974 had given a presentation at the Royal Institution in London. The Royal Institution was made famous in the 19th century by several people, but the first two was Sir Humphrey Davy, and the person who really made it famous was Michael Faraday. So the Christmas lecture by Eric Laithwaite was all about gyroscopes, amongst one thing. Professor Laithwaite thought that gyroscopes could be explained by something that we now call the GEM equations. If you look at the slide, you may recognize Maxwell's equations at the top there. And there's those curl terms that we looked at right at the beginning, and you now know what a curl is. It's just you grab hold of the whatever it is and twist your fingers around in the direction of either the magnetic field, the fluid lines, or the gravitomagnetic field. So there we are. Let's look at the GEM equations. And the first one says curl of gravity equals the change of the gravitomagnetic field. That's the H. The next one to it, which is that upside down delta with a dot G, is in fact Newton's formula. That's Newton's only bit. So in Newton's gravity theory, that's the only bit. All the rest isn't used. That's because we don't use gravitomagnetism. We use visa or kinetic energy. Now, what we want to find out is, can we find out what gravitomagnetism is? Can we jiggle it? Because if we can, we might be able to create gravity. Now there's equivalencies. You'll all be familiar in terms of gravity is equivalent to acceleration. If you're in the lift and it accelerates upwards, you feel heavier. So that's an acceleration. You can make an effect across space and have an effect on a mass. You can't do that with acceleration. You actually have to push on the mass to make it accelerate. So though they're equivalent, they're not the same, because one's got field properties, the other one hasn't. Now we come on to H, or gravitomagnetism. That is equivalent to angular velocity. If you've got a gyro and you spin it, it's got angular velocity. But to make that spin, you have to actually spin the mass. But gravitomagnetism has a field property. Why can't we see it? It's so incredibly weak because, let's go back to magnetism. Magnetism, if you look at the first equation, curl E, it's got a mu sign there. That's the permeability of the magnetic field across space. Now come on to the analog down at the bottom, curl of little h, and you can see there's a gamma. And if you look afterwards, there's what's called B equals that peculiar sign, which I call eta. B equals eta h, which is at the bottom on the right-hand side. Now, if you're looking on the right-hand side of the picture, the speed of light squared, I'm sure you all know, is 1 over epsilon mu. That's the permittivity of electric field in space times the permeability of the magnetic field. And underneath there we've got c squared. Again, the speed of light squared. That's 1 over gamma, which is, I prefer gamma, it's a better feel for me, but gamma is equal to 1 over 4 pi big G. That big G is Newton's inverse square effect. But notice that if we look at c squared, I've got 1 over gamma times this, what I call eta. Now that eta is the permeability of the H field in space. Turns out to be absolutely tiny. Next slide, please. We had a chance to, what I didn't mention to you was Professor Laithwaite got in trouble because he demonstrated an inertial thrust machine. And there were a number of academics in the audience that didn't believe it. One of the inertial thrust machines that was around at that time was called Kidd's inertial thrust machine. He was a Scotsman who lived up near Dundee. Kidd wasn't the only one. There were a number of other ones. Some of them had actually been patented. So Kidd was quite willing for us to test his device at Wharton. It was on the news, it'd been on television, so we tested it. There's a picture of it at the bottom left-hand corner there. It was 2 gyros which waved around, up, waved and span, and they joggled up and down. And in throwing themselves up and throwing themselves down, they created enormous accelerations. But did they actually change weight while they were doing it? We put it on a bungee because the bungee would just damp out the accelerations. We weren't interested in the size of the accelerations. We were interested, was there any change of weight? And we did the tests, and the top one there, you can see that within the error band, we couldn't see anything at all. On one occasion, they seemed to be outside the error band, seemed to say, oh, bit strange. We weren't sure. So that was 1 out of, I forget how many, 20, I think, that we did. It was July 1991. There was no way, as we will see later, we could carry on doing any more. So we weren't very good scientists. If you have an anomaly, a good scientist will keep poking it to find out what caused it. So unfortunately, we weren't able to do that. Next slide, please. Now, in 1989, I think, 1989, I had an opportunity to go and visit Dr. Robert Forward. Now, if you know anything about gravity studies, Robert Forward has been one of the people that's been pushing it, he's a pioneer. So I went up right to the north of Scotland. You may have heard of the nuclear power station there at Dounreay. Well, he lived in a cottage at Ray, which was actually just near Dounreay. He wrote a paper I should say he got his PhD working with Joseph Weber, working on looking for gravity waves. Joseph Weber had come up with a long metal cylinder, rather like an antenna for detecting radio waves. They also came up with another device which they called a gravity interferometer, which was actually built where Robert Forward was employed, which was at the Hughes Research Laboratory at Malibu. That's another story. So Robert Forward had written this paper saying, theoretically, it should be possible to create anti-gravity with, I put the picture at the bottom there, with a toroid. And if so, with the toroid, if it's electric, it will create a magnetic field inside. If you change the electric field through the toroid, then that blue magnetic field will change. A changing magnetic field creates a gravity field. And that gravity field I've shown, an electric field, a changing magnetic field creates an electric field, which I've shown by that straight line, black line there in the center. And he gave us a model, which when you check it out, it's an approximation, but it's perfectly theoretical. But there are some theory, you have to make assumptions. And at the top there is the electric field that you create. And I've put E epsilon mu, that's the free space value of the permeability of magnetism. And mu r is the relative permeability. And that's the changing current. And there you are, A squared is the radius of the electric lines there in the toroid, and R is the radius of the whole toroid. Okay, I'm just reading that. I'm not sure what that's about. Now, Robert Forward talked about changing those electric toroid and having a big piping and passing fluid through it, but he said it was impossible. However, if you think about it, electric charge has got both charge, but it's also got a gravitational charge as well, because an electron has an electric field and it has a gravitational field. So I put it in, now that's not in his paper, but it's perfectly feasible to write it like that, where again you've got eta naught. Now that eta naught is 10 to the minus 20, sorry, yes it is, 10 to the minus 26. This is why Forward said it won't work. But notice the relative permeability. Now that, probably small, but we don't know what it is. If we go to the one above it, the mu r is the relative permeability of magnetism. Generally, that's between 0 and 1. For a superconductor, it's 0. For most materials, it's about 1. But for some materials, like a material called mu metal, it's 50,000. 50,000 is a bit different to 1. Now, we don't know about eta r. There may be materials which have properties of 50,000. That suddenly starts to make a difference. They might be more than that. They might be 50 million, I don't know. Until someone is able to look at a gravitomagnetic field and start poking it about, we won't know. So in my mind, I have wondered, Robert Forward, did he go back to the Hughes research place and say to somebody, I wonder whether it's possible to change that eta r and make something work, and then we would have a gravity field created too. Next slide, please. My boss, Tom Smith, retired in 1990. As we'll see later, a lot of people were retiring. In 1977, the aerospace companies were nationalised, but were denationalised in 1977. So in 1978, when I joined, it had only been denationalised 1 year. All the time, the company was changing, trying to get itself sorted out. In 1990, Tom Smith had been working for what was first English Electric, then British Aircraft Corporation, finally British Aerospace. And in 1990, after 40 odd years, he retired. So I got a new boss who decided to call it something new. He called it Business Strategy Department, or British, no, it wasn't. It was called the Future Business Strategy Group. By that time, I'd been working for Tom, and Tom Smith had allowed me to investigate this gravity side. And I'd organised a meeting with several universities within the UK. And we'd come up with a meeting in March 1990. And there's the list of things that we studied. So gravitational wave research was very popular. I mean, would it ever be possible to use gravitational waves to detect aeroplanes? I mean, that's a bit like the work that Gary Stevenson was working on with his high frequency gravity waves. Fifth, fourth experiments at that time in 1990 were in the news. The superconducting gravity gradiometer is a way of moving submarines, for instance, without having to make any noise with your sonometers or anything like that. I was more interested in Faraday's gravity experiments. Very few people seem to have followed it up. There was the quantum effects in microgravity, which has gone on in the past 20 or 30 years. I was again interested myself in Heaviside's linearized gravity theory and the GEM equations. These GEM equations were first studied by Maxwell himself. He wondered, having developed the electromagnetic model, well, why it looks very similar to gravity. And he'd pondered over it for a while, and then he busy starting other. He had to start the Clarendon laboratory in Cambridge. He was far too busy to bother with it too much. Heaviside was a mathematician in the 1890s. He had a look at it, but decided that parameter, that field, the eta, the permeability, was too small. So he didn't pursue it either. We had somebody coming up from Kent who looked at a new model of the electron, and we had somebody from Birmingham University looking at gravitational things. So it was all ongoing. It was very interesting. I published the report. Next slide, please. And that report was sent off to the library, and the library put it on the exchange with NASA. NASA had an exchange agreement with British Aerospace, and they would swap documents. So that went off to NASA. I don't know what we got back in return. Well, in fact, I do. We got back a report called an electric propulsion study, which actually looked at more than I'd done. I hope you all know about the electric propulsion study. It's on the floor down there. If you haven't asked me in questions and answers, and I'll tell you about it. Now, what I hadn't realized is that the technical director, who was a nuclear physicist originally, he was quite interested in my report, and he wanted it because he was going to be made a professor at Salford University. Salford is where the British Aerospace apprentices went. Just check my time. What am I up to? I need to get a bit of a move on. So he asked me to tell him about it. I showed him and he read the report. He sent me off to Salford to talk to the people there. I explained it to them and they said, oh, yeah, that's all legitimate. I went back and told him. He said, good, I'll go and give it. I didn't want to be made a fool. And there he asked the people in the future concepts thing, draw me some pictures, draw me a GA, and I'll take those with me. Off he went. It went down so well. He came back. He was so pleased with himself. He gave the lecture at the Institute of Mechanical Engineering in London. That got publicised, went to the press. Then he had an interview on the radio. Next thing he knew, we had all sorts of people asking him for more information. And that's where Nick Cook came in, because Brian Young, who was the technical director, said to Nick Cook, you go and talk to Ron Evans. I think he'd had his fun and he didn't want to be involved with any more. So Nick came and talked to me, or rather I went to talk to Nick. And later on, the Hunt for Zero point appeared where Nick mentioned the BAE program, but he was more interested in what the Germans had been doing during the wartime, and also what the United States had been doing. Would anybody tell him, were they working on stealth? By and large, they wouldn't. He came back thinking, well, maybe they are, maybe they're not. Next slide, please. So I'll go to this very quickly. As I said to you, we were still restructuring. 1990 was a very difficult time. So that BAE was selling off things left, right and centre. They were still the biggest exporter for the United Kingdom. They were having talks with DASA about merging. Early on in the year, they thought they might have been bought by GEC. But they managed to get through that. And then in 1999, they managed to buy Marconi from GEC. And then in 1999, that became BAE Systems. So there were a lot of changes going on where I was working. And they closed some of the sites, and there are other sites. In fact, if Rob James is there, perhaps he will tell us whether they closed Plymouth at that time. I can't remember when they did. So 1990, I was in the Wharton Advanced Technologies side. I'd got a small group doing various things. Everything was very part-time. Lots of studies going on. I had to remember a four-legged robot walking around the department at the time with all the problems going on. It wasn't looked on very favourably. Next thing I knew, the exploratory studies group had been closed, so I'd have to get another job. I'd only got another job for about a year, and then that was closed and I had to look for another job. I thought I was going to be made redundant. Fortunately, the person who had taken over the stealth group that I'd started said, well, come and work with me. So I went to work for him. That was lucky. Then in 1995, there were so many people wanting to be managers that the technologists career branch was started. So I ended up being an advisor. Mathematicians aren't seen as specialists. They're sort of generalists. So next slide, please. Right, I think we can just go through this very quickly, but this is really the start of Project Greenglow. Because with the technologists, they'd actually got a little bit of money. In 1980, again, with all the company in flux, really, Wharton had a lot of research money at the time. In fact, when I'd responded to the interview in 1977 to apply for the job, they were the biggest research and development aerodrome in Europe, and they had a lot of research money. But in 1980, the headquarters in London decided, no, we've got what was the Missile Research Centre in Bristol. We're going to make that the BAE Research Centre. So we want the research money from Wharton. We'll send it to Bristol. And if Wharton want to do research, they'll have to go through Bristol and get it done down there. So they'd lost a lot of money, but the technologists had got a little bit of money back. So in March 97, I'd got John Allen, who had been made redundant or had actually taken early retirement from Kingston. Kingston was where the Harrier and the Hawk were built, but they'd closed that site and all that work had been moved to Wharton. But he came up to talk to us about the future of aerospace, and he talked to the future concepts engineers. And John, back in 1970, had written a book, and in it there was a chapter about gravity. He was very keen on gravity. His boss, whose name escapes me for the moment, wasn't too keen on John talking about gravity. Like so many bosses, it sounds like anti-gravity, and they're all scared stiff of anti-gravity. So that went very well. I asked John to do a study for us, and that's this blue report on the right there. Supposing we had an anti-gravity engine, how would it change aerodynamics, vehicles? So he went away and did that for us. That later became an AIAA paper. Also at the same time, I went to our local university, University of Central Lancashire, and got a professor there to do a study. Faraday had been very interested in heat experiments, so I got him to do a study. It actually turned out to be something that had already been discovered back in 1897 by somebody called Leduc, but I didn't know that at the time. Then I went to a meeting with Robin Tucker at the University of Lancashire. Professor Robin Tucker was a professor of gravitational physics. So if anybody should know about anti-gravity, he should. He was a bit wary, but tackling it from an Einstein's general relativity side, he thought it was worth having a go at doing something. They had a team there of 4 or 5 general relativity people. So he suggested, why don't we come up with a joint program? We'll fund part of it, or we'll get money to fund it, and you'll have to fund the other. So I went back to the technologists, I proposed a program, and it was agreed very quickly, and we got something started. Robin Tucker became the academic advisor. So quite clearly, British Aerospace was not doing the research work. The research work was being done at United Kingdom universities. So Robin was the academic advisor. John Allen was going to be the design consultant. Now that might be done by BAE. So in 1997, that began the start. It was all funded. We had some small support from Rolls-Royce. We started with a lecture series. We had a couple of academics from Greece, Athens, I think. My goodness, we had a big audience from MOD, from Rolls-Royce, from BAE, MOD, and those academics were given a hard time. Then in 1999, MOD contacted me and said, look, you should really be having a look at a photon drive. It's work that was done by the Soviet Union. And one of the people that worked on it was Sergei Vinogradov, then at Kharkov University, part of the Soviet Union. He's going to work with Paul Smith. So we got some funding from that. And then along came Podkletnov. It was all in the news. And then I learned that students at Sheffield University were also studying it. I don't know whether Clive is in your audience, Tim, but he will know. I went to Clive Woods and said to him, perhaps we could fund a little bit for you to check it out. And he agreed, a good idea. I've put a picture of Podkletnov's part of his device. The brown is his superconducting ring. It was the YBCO ring, yttrium barium copper oxide. It's called a type 2 ring, which becomes superconducting, getting near to room temperatures. And then those 3 solenoids are the thing that make it work. Now you're going to have to cast your mind back to that toroid. That, in fact, is a part toroid, isn't it? If I filled in the spaces, it would be a toroid. And what did Robert Forward tell us? That if you change the current, it created both an electric and a gravitational field. Now, Dr. Podkletnov had put his device in a metallic container and made it superconducting. It was metallic, it was a Faraday screen. No electric field could get out, but you can't screen against gravity. So maybe gravity did get out. Maybe yttrium barium copper oxide is this very thing we're looking for, the permeability of gravitomagnetism with a high value. I don't know. So on the right-hand bottom corner is one of Clive Wood's reports. Next slide, please. Right, we're halfway and I've only got a quarter of an hour to go. So John Allen did the study for us. I've mentioned that already. Done that, we've done that. Right. To Dundee. Right. Sorry, I'm just having to remind myself what I'm going to be talking about. So 1999 saw the formation, November 99, it wasn't really until 2000 that BAE Systems was formed. And everything came to a standstill in terms of research. All the money that we had at Wharton was frozen. So although the universities that were doing work, they carried on, we couldn't pay them any money. So the ATCs were now, so that what had been the original British Aerospace Research Centre now joined with what had been the Marconi Research Centre. So the British Aerospace one at Bristol had dealt mostly with aerodynamics. They'd also, I mean, when I'd run the stealth program, I'd arranged to get stealth signatures, a program called G58. So we were starting to predict from modelling what the radar signature was. All that work went down to Bristol, and the team, I'm afraid, at Wharton had to go and find other work. But the people at Bristol, I better not say any more about this, I shouldn't really. So the team at the Baddow Research Centre, was at Great Baddow, which is in Essex, which is in southeast England. They were really working on electronics and systems and things like that. So between the two of them, they decided they shouldn't be funding Greenglow until they'd had their own look at it and had some assessment. So they had an assessment done by Glasgow University, and that's that blue report there. So that took a bit of time to do, and that had to be funded by the ATC, which included both of them, and it also included Rolls-Royce. They were interested to know what was going on. So that was funded. The report came back and they said the Greenglow thing was really looking more at gravitational and gravitomagnetic fields. It was a field study. They thought that it should really be more, or they ought to have more about the quantum aspects of gravity. And I think the reason was, about that time, Hal Puthoff and his colleagues had been looking at inertia and saying it could be a quantum effect. Anyway, the universities agreed to fund what Wharton had already started on, and we'd have to get some quantum work. So I managed to get people at Birmingham, Professor Clive Speake now, looking at Casimir study. They're actually using a superconducting gravity gradiometer, but they could do a Casimir study by the side with it. And the Lancaster University people, they went off to New Zealand to look at the gravitomagnetic field around the Earth. I'll say a bit more about that in a minute. And in 2000, we also got Mark Millis to come and give us a talk about what they were doing on the NASA Breakthrough Propulsion Physics program. And then we told them what we were doing. In fact, at the time, well, I'll just tell you what happened. At the end of all of it, we were all getting on very well together, and Mark Millis arranged, I think it was probably through what was called EOARD, which is an American centre in London looking at all research going on in Europe. And the people at EOARD agreed to fund the university people that are working at Wharton to go and give their work, results of their work in the United States. Why United Kingdom can't fund things like that, I don't know. Sorry, I shouldn't be saying this. Not very good for UK. But UK will work on some things. The UK MOD supported what we were doing, but they were scared stiff it would be seen as a UFO study, and they couldn't afford to be mixed up with UFOs. Maybe Nick Pope might tell us something about that. In 2001, I got an introduction to somebody called Graham Ennis. I thought he was a UFO person, and he'd got what he called his Field Propulsion Conference at Sussex University. I was a bit apprehensive at the beginning. It turned out to be very good, and it turned out to have lots of what I call important people interested in field propulsion. People like Hal Puthoff were there. Alan Holt was there. And there were a lot of other people, if I could remember their names now, that you would recognize. But in 2004, that was the 3 years up, I thought we'd done a good program, but we hadn't made any breakthroughs. So it was very adventurous. It was a high payoff if we had made something, but it was very risky. Next slide, please. So in retirement, I thought we'd run a good program. So I sat down and I wrote a book. The first book I wrote was too long, but I trimmed it down, and then I tried to get an agent for it. Everybody, my children especially, tell me I can't sell books because I put equations in them. Okay, I went to 48 agents and publishers. They all said, no, thank you. One or two said, yeah, interesting, but no, thank you. So I persevered. Eventually, I thought, no, well, I'm going to self-publish. I want to leave a record of what we did, because I had the feeling that some thought that the people who had done it, and it had all been a part-time thing at Wharton, none of us had been allowed to work on it full-time. We all had other jobs. And I thought, without the record, it's just going to be forgotten. So I wrote it. And before I knew what, I'd got an email from the publishers saying they'd been contacted by the BBC. They wanted to do an Horizon program. Horizon is a science program. It's very well known. It's got another name in North America. Actually, I'd been contacted twice before by previous editors. I didn't dare say yes because I knew the managers at Wharton. I don't know whether they're jealous or just they didn't like things like that being aired on the TV. Again, probably it was the link with Antigravity. So it was Steve Crabtree that contacted me. Was I interested? Well, I didn't work with BAE anymore, and I had some other ideas. I said yes. He introduced me to his producer, a guy called Nick Young, and a lady called, I'll remember her name in a minute. Sorry if she ever looks at this. It's very rude of me. Anyway, the voiceover was done by a man called Peter Capaldi. Now, you might not know him in North America, but he's Doctor Who in the UK, very well known. He's the 12th Doctor Who. So Nick Young got his program together. I was interviewed in various places. So he talked about the UK Project Greenglow program. He then went to visit Mark Millis and learn about that. He wanted me to repeat the Laithwaite gyro thing that had got Laithwaite into so much trouble at the RI. I wasn't so keen, but he said, you know, this is not just a science program, it's also an entertainment program. So we did it. He went off to Moscow to see Podkletnov and learn about that. He talked about anti-gravity propulsion. Some people said it can't be right. In my view, some of the academics that he visited made statements that, to my mind, are wrong. I remember one said it's impossible because you can't have a warp drive because as a thing accelerates, it becomes, as the mass accelerates, it gets infinite in mass. But a propulsion system, a warp drive, has got a positive mass and a negative mass. And if you look at the mass equation, it's got a square root in it, Einstein's square root mass. Certainly the positive mass goes up till it approaches infinity when it's at the speed of light. But the negative mass is also negative infinity mass. And that approaches the speed of light, and the two cancel out. On the way, of course, they've both been accelerating and radiating off energy. So he went to visit the people at CERN who had been looking at antimatter, and they were dropping anti-hydrogen. I'm not an antimatter person. It seems to me at the moment, the view is that antimatter has got positive mass, but the people at CERN will tell us whether it has or it hasn't. He then went to interview Scheuer, which is still in the news at the moment. Everybody said, no, that's not possible. So Mr. Dr. Scheuer ignored them like all good engineers and said, oh, well, I'll try it anyway. And he seemed to get a tiny effect. I should say that our photon drive also had a very small effect. Our photon drive was open. Roger Sawyer's is closed. Everything is inside. I've got some views about why it might work. Roger's got his own views. Other people have now tried it. I think Boeing have tried it, and I think other people have tried it too. There does seem to be something there. Nobody quite accepts the thing. In my view, engineers should try things like that, and then it's up to the mathematicians and other theorists to come up with the theory as to why it might work. Now, coming back to is it possible to use gravity to detect things? Well, the MOD have been working for a long time on a quantum accelerometer. At the moment, it can detect masses still in the meters, but you never know, in the future it might come up with something more. Now, the breakthrough propulsion physics, I forget when it was finished, 2002 or 2003, I think. Marcus Millis has started his own thing now. And Greenglow one ended in 2004. So there was nothing in the UK, nothing in North America. And in Germany, for EU, Dresden University, they started a program there. So that's still going. So Europe has now got a program. UK and North America hasn't, as far as I know. Right, now, what's the time? Am I all right just to continue on a bit longer, Tim?
Yeah, I would say keep going. It looks like you've only got a few slides left, so if you're able to just kind of push through them.
Next slide, please. Right, I put method of detection. So the first one, you'll know all about those. That's common ways of detecting magnetism. You might not recognize that long grey tube with a green laser beam through it. That's called Faraday rotation. I want to talk a bit more about that in a minute. Now, you can detect enforced rotation using a dry wheel. If you try to turn the flywheel around forcibly, you'll find it has its own deciding where it's going to go. And it's just vectors. So some vectors will tell you how it's going to move. There's something called a ring laser gyro, which was developed in the 60s and 70s. They're used in the aircraft industry for navigation, and telling you where you are and things like that. And that will also detect rotation. But you have to fix the device to the device you want to detect whether it's rotating or not, like an aeroplane. There's also a much cheaper device called a fiber optic gyro, which are now fitted in all sorts of systems. That can also detect rotation, but again, you have to fix it to the device you want to twist. Now we come on to gravitomagnetism, which we haven't really detected yet. If you use a sphere, it has its own gravitomagnetic dipole. It has its own angular velocity as well. But if you put angular velocity into a gravitomagnetic field, it won't interact. But the gravitomagnetic dipole of that spinning sphere will, if it's strong enough. It has a gravitomagnetic dipole moment, and this is what they did in the NASA Gravity Probe B. So they had to have a field that was strong enough that that could be detected by a spinning sphere. I'll talk about that in a moment. And then again, you could also use a ring laser gyro. I'll talk about that in a moment. Next slide, please. Right, so this is NASA Gravity Probe B, nothing to do with Greenglow, but it's interesting to me. If you look at underneath that black rectangle, it says HE equals 1/4 pi, blah, 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 blah. That is the analog of a dipole from electricity or magnetism. So that's where it comes from. It's exactly the same, and you can get it. It's the moment of inertia of the Earth, the angular velocity of the Earth. The distance from the center of the Earth is r. So You can work that out, and it turns out to be very small. And what NASA was trying to do was detect the gravitomagnetic field of the Earth, and also because the mass of the Earth's there, Einstein said it would warp Earth, and the NASA experiment wanted to detect the warp of Earth. And I forget when they sent the experiment up, but 2004, I think. It's not written on there, but it might be written here. Let me just check quickly. No, I can't see it. 2004, I think. So if you look carefully, you can see the Earth, gravitomagnetic field, that little tiny white circle with a red K underneath it is the spinning ball. It's got an axis, angular velocity axis, which is looking at a star. It goes round that dotted circle. As the Earth spins, that dotted circle does not move. In space, it's fixed. If it wasn't fixed, if that ball went round with the Earth, there'd be no magnetic field. That's relativity for you. So you need it to move. And you can see when we look in 2007, having done, it took 18 months to collect the data. So 2004, 18 months. It took another year and so to detect the space-time curvature, but they've detected it. The next thing they wanted to do was to detect the gravitomagnetic field. And you can see how small it is, 0.042 of a second of arc. And they managed to detect that in 2011. Now, as my technical director once said to me, what's the use of gravitomagnetism? It's too small, forget it. Well, looking at that seems to confirm it. We're not going to be able to create a gravity field from that. Anyway, we'll go on about in a minute. Look at the bottom right-hand corner. There's the Earth spinning, and there's Australia, and at the very edge is New Zealand. And the people from University of Lancashire, Robin Tucker, and a few others at the University of Canterbury, they've got the world's largest ring laser gyro. It's fixed to the Earth, so it can pick up the Earth's angular velocity shown as omega E there. That's easy. They can do more than that. That omega E is like a spinning top. It precesses. I forget how big it is. It's about a meter or so. They can detect that oscillation of the Earth's like a spinning top, no problems. What Robin Tucker wanted to do is a spinning top, so it must have a gravitomagnetic field. Hang on a minute. It's not moving relative to the Earth. What the Earth is doing, it's spinning relative to space. So now we're looking at the other way around. As the Earth spins, it's spinning relative to the Earth, so it's spinning to space. So what they're trying to do is pick up the gravitomagnetic field of space. It will be the same as the gravitomagnetic field that the NASA experiment will try to detect. Next slide, please. Right. Now, this is a conundrum to me. When you drop a mass, we know it's weightless. If you're in a lift and it drops away from your feet, it accelerates downwards and you float. But if you look at that equation there, if you remember the GEM equation right at the beginning, it said if you could change the gravitomagnetic field, you create a gravity field. And it's that gravity field that we are interested in. But we add that permeability term, that what I call eta there. Now, I've also told you there's an equivalence between gravity and acceleration. But if you're going to cancel a gravity field, you can only cancel it with a gravity field, not an acceleration. You've got to have a gravity field cancelling a gravity field. So where's the gravity field? We look at that and we say, well, that eta there, sorry, that's my thing. I don't know whether you can see that. Has that appeared on your pictures? No. Right. Oh dear, what did you, right, it's gone. I can write that out as the gravitomagnetic permeability in space outside the mass and the gravitomagnetic permeability inside the mass. Now, outside the mass is 10 to the minus 26. We can forget it. So that first term on the right-hand side is negligible. So although there might be a gravitomagnetic field outside, we can't detect it. For the whole mass of the Earth spinning, you know it was tiny. But what's going on inside the mass? It's got a gravitomagnetic field inside the mass too. Is the gravitomagnetic permeability bigger? How on earth do we measure it and decide? Because if we could make it big, we might be able to control gravitomagnetism, and if we can change it, we've got gravity. Next slide, please. Well, I don't know what the answer is. The thing about a falling mass is unstable. It's very difficult to model mathematically. The thing I know that I can do, because I can base it on an analog, I know about line charges, so I can do a mass charge and I could drop it. And now it's steady because I've shown the big mass at the top there, but that's really that element in the middle of that line mass. And if it moves with a constant speed, I can work out all the values for the gravitomagnetic fields, both inside the mass and outside. And if you look about halfway down, I've written Hx equals 1 over 2 pi r, and it circles round. And I've written H int, which is internal, and that circles round. And if you go and look in your electromagnetism's book, you'll find what are called Biot-Savart laws, and they're exactly the same. Now, from our model of gravitomagnetism, we get eta, and that tells you that outside it's zero or virtually zero. Well, that's because the permeability, the density of free space acts almost like a solid. You might ask yourself, well, I can't see it. This is a question that people like Newton have asked, people like Maxwell have asked, and even people like Michelson. Why can't we see it? It's got infinite energy. We can't see it. Anyway, so if rho is infinite, that means the gravitomagnetic permeability is infinite. Sorry, is zero, because 1 over infinity is zero. And that is 10 to the minus 26 in real terms. And then if we look to see what the inside permeability is, we work it out, and we can work out what inside is going on. The induced permeability is V over R. Well, that's quite big. We should be able to measure that somehow. Even on a cylinder wall, it's the speed of it dropping over the radius of the mass. But how can we measure it? It's omega. Now, we know we can measure omega in terms of rotation. So we know when we are doing gravitomagnetic tests, we always know what happens because we can do the equivalent thing. A rotation tells you what's going to happen. So we know what's going to happen with gravitomagnetism, except it will be a heck of a lot smaller. Next slide, please. Right, I said I would mention Faraday rotation. So the picture on the left with that yellow solenoid, and I've got a glass tube, and I've got a green laser passing through a polarizer, making the laser vertically polarized, passes through a glass tube, and it comes out the other side through another polarizer. If I turn the solenoid on and create a magnetic field, it makes that linearly polarized light twist. So if you now look on the picture on the right, that is part of a conductor, a line. I'm going to pass a current I through it. And you know, as well as I do, creates a magnetic field around it. This was first done back in 1820 by Mr. Ørsted. Right, so how can we detect that field? Well, you can use, now I've got to use something that's in line with that magnetic field, and I can use Faraday rotation. If I put, instead of having a line chart, that was a linear one on the left, now I want to do it circular. And if I create a coil and wrap it round that thing and pass a polarized light in and then pass a current through it, it's in line with the magnetic field, so the line will rotate. Right, believe it or not, this is what was done at BAE. This was based on a Boeing, is Gary in the audience? This was based on a Boeing idea, and it works. So they used it in lightning trials. They would have a structure and they would pulse it with a very high electric charge, and they would use that fiber optic coil, work out what the magnetic field was, and from that, using those Biot-Savart equations, they could work out what the magnetic field was. Right, so now the question is, can we use the same idea to detect, that was detecting rotation of a magnetic field. Can we detect rotation of a gravitomagnetic field in the same way? Well, magnetic fields and H fields are twinned anyway. We've already accepted that because charge E, when it moves along with mass E, so the two work together. Can we use mu metal to separate them? Don't know. Does Faraday rotation occur with gravitomagnetism? I think it must do, but is it big enough to detect? In fact, it makes me wonder whether the fact that whether Faraday rotation occurs at all might be because it's mixed up with Faraday rotation, with gravitomagnetism. And if you took the gravitomagnetism away, I wonder whether magnetic field would still cause rotation. I don't know. Next slide, please. I'm very keen, as you saw right with my early meeting with the universities back in 1990, Faraday's first gravity experiment. I was just looking in a book here, which is about Faraday, and at the end, it's about the Zeeman effect, which you may or may not know about. Zeeman was looking for the change in light when you put a magnetic field. So Faraday had a spectrometer, was shining light through it and getting all the various patterns, and then putting a magnetic field near it to see whether it changed. It didn't do anything. That was in about 1860 something. And Zeeman was looking through Faraday's diary and wondering, Faraday tried it. I wonder whether there's anything in it. He tried it, and guess what? With more sensitive equipment, he detected it. Well, there you are. So Faraday's mind was just amazing. He wasn't a mathematician, but he was brilliant at understanding what nature did. So this is Faraday's first gravity experiment. If you think of his induction experiment, it was very similar. What he did was put a coil round an object, a cylinder of something, iron, copper, or bismuth. He then attached a coil around it, and he dropped it because he thought, as that mass dropped, he thought that it's just possible it might create an electric current, and he would see that on the gyro. Just like his induction experiment, he thought it would only be temporary, so you have to be very careful to watch it. And his first experiment, it did do that. He thought he'd found something, but then he realized when he dropped a wire through a magnetic field, it created an effect, so he had to twist the wire. And when he did that, it didn't do anything. He spent some time doing other experiments. He never went back to this one. And I've looked at it and I've thought, I think he was probably right. That something does occur around it. Well, theoretically, it does seem to be the gravitomagnetic field. But how are we going to detect it? It's no good looking outside that mass. We've got to look inside. Now, inside, of course, is a bit difficult, but we can actually put the coil on the surface. The thing about gravity and gravitomagnetism, in the NASA Gravity Probe B experiment, they had to, that ball that was spinning, they had to enclose it in mu metal. They didn't want Earth's magnetic field interfering with gravitomagnetism. Gravitomagnetism is not shielded. Gravity is not shielded. We've only got one sort of mass, so you can't shield mass from outside effects, nor can you with gravitomagnetism. So if you put that fiber optic coil on the surface of the falling mass, what's going on inside the mass will create a gravitomagnetic field. You can't shield it, so it will get to the surface and it will be on the surface. It won't be outside the surface because that's where the permeability is so small, but it might still be there on the surface. So that's my idea for checking it. Of course, you don't really need the mass itself because the fiber optic itself has got mass. You could just drop a big coil and see whether there's any effect on polarization. So those are the two ideas. Is that the last slide? Oh no, next slide, please. So I think I'll read it very quickly. Have we got time? No, I won't read it. What I'm saying here is that Hans Ørsted discovered the magnetic field around a moving charge in 1820. We want to detect a gravitomagnetic field around a moving mass. If we can do that and start probing it in a laboratory, just like everybody else probed what Ørsted had discovered, we are going to be able to probe gravitomagnetism and work out how to change it. Once we can change it, we can change gravity and make gravity. That's the end. Thank you for listening. Okay, Tim.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. Thank you, Ron. And I should apologize for some of the difficulties. There's a lot to manage having Zoom going at the same time as screen share. It kind of shifts the controls and stuff around. Thank you very much for presenting. So I'd like to do Q&A session. Let's jump right into that. And I have to go in here and chat and take a look. Now, normally I manage this as we go, but again, with screen share, it kind of hides it. So let me see. Or does anyone, let me go to gallery view here. Would anyone just like to raise their hand? Let me see, we have Gary.
Okay, I'm waiting to Rob James.
Oh, well, let me go to Gary first because he's on my top left here. Gary, what can I help you with?
Yeah, wow. Thanks so much, Ron, for this really fascinating history. I'm wondering, was there ever a systematic attempt to look at unexplained aerial phenomena, their behavior, and did that guide any of the work of Project Greenglow?
Podketnov, did you say? Sorry, Gary, I didn't get the end bit.
Yeah, I was more interested in unexplained aerial phenomena. Did you ever have a systematic look at that as part of Project Greenglow? And if so, did it guide any of your?
You mean the KID inertial thrust machine?
Well, as an example.
We never went back to it.
Okay.
Never.
Okay. So let me go to Wayne now. If he's with us, Wayne, are you have your hand raised?
Yeah, I'm here.
Okay.
Yeah. Hi. Very fascinating talk there. I'm just gonna turn this. Sorry. I have a silly background on there. It's kind of embarrassing from a different call. Anyway, the gravitomagnetism thing, I've experimented quite a bit with rotating like brass cylinders and stuff, looking for gravitomagnetism, thinking that it might be happening on the nuclear level, like the rotation of the nucleus or the angular momentum of the nucleus that would have its own gravitomagnetic field, and then perhaps by rotation of a large mass, a metal disk, that polarization might happen, making it more detectable. But I just don't know. I don't know if there's a way to mathematically calculate what that field would be. And I guess that's kind of my question is that knowable or calculable? So we can make some kind of prediction and know what sort of range or ballpark to be looking at with instrumentation. Thanks.
Do you want me to say anything, Tim?
Oh, yeah. I would say go ahead. Go ahead.
I've actually done a calculation of that, Wayne, in the book, plugging the book, which you can't buy now, but you can get the electronic version. But in there, I did do a calculation. There's two things. One, I'm just trying to think of the man's name. There was somebody back in the 70s. I remember Lathwaite showing me his papers, looking at the atomic. I wish I could, perhaps Rob Chambers can remember his name. I can't remember. There was also another paper, which I've got, but I can't remember his name, where I think it was an AIAA paper, no, it was an IEEE paper, where he was spinning two cylinders very close together. Again, it's in the book. I could look it if I've got time. But so the answer is, at the moment, it seems to be too small. That's that eta parameter, 10 to the minus 26 across space. Now, the Russians, way back in some of their papers, they were also looking at that effect. I've never found any more, but it was mentioned in one of Robert Forward's papers.
Wonderful. And Rob, did you want to add anything to here? Let me ask you to unmute there.
I can add a little bit of color, maybe. A couple of things that Ron mentioned, which might be of interest. When he mentioned HOTOL, which was one of the projects that was worked on in the 80s and so on, that has essentially now become, well, people who worked on it have become part of Skylon, which is potentially a better way to get into orbit, a more practical way to a single stage to orbit vehicle. So there are still some activities, but again, it's quite small scale. Also, the radar question during the war, one of the earliest examples I think was the Mosquito, which was a British fighter bomber, which was wood, and I think this is when they realized that they couldn't detect them. So this gave a clue as to the early stealth capability. So so just to add a bit of detail to some things that Ron mentioned.
Oh, wonderful, wonderful. Well, and again, I know you have a presentation as well, although the way it's looking, we'll probably, if you're open to it, maybe next week.
Yes, no problem at all.
Absolutely. Yeah. So does anyone else have any questions?
Who's going to do the experiment for me? I want to know.
Yes, I'm trying to figure out how to use the raise hand icon thing, but I've got my hand raised on camera. I have no idea how to put that little icon thing that Wayne popped up there. So Wayne had played around quite a bit, as he talked about, with gravitomagnetism, and it's something that we were looking into in our little research group. We have a WhatsApp sort of think tank about alternative propulsion and gravity control. And so one of the experiments that was proposed was, is there possibly a coupling between a magnetic field or a moving magnetic flux and the trajectory of a laser beam? Because laser beam is effectively controlled in terms of its divergence or its curl. It can be modified by the curl vector theoretically, because a laser beam has a magnetic and electric component. And so if you already partially saturate the magnetic component in space, it may be possible, but it's one of those strange things on the edge of physics where it's not really looked at about a lot. Physicists don't really want to talk about it. In academia, it's so unstandard that you can't really get many people to look into it. So what we did is Wayne performed an experiment with a small low resolution diode laser and put a large magnet, kind of like this one, large neodymium disk magnet next to that beam, and he crossed the beam across in this direction, and by basically waving this magnet up and down, bouncing it across the room at that point, and then having it reflect back onto the wall. So a total distance of about 30 feet, he was able to notice a tiny little change in the total position of the laser beam. Now, there's a lot of reasons that it could have happened, but I wanted to do the experiment myself to see if there was anything to it. So we performed it again with a laboratory grade helium neon laser, which has much better beam profile and characteristics. And we bounced it a total distance of about 40 feet and looked at our beam profile on the wall. And we were able to get that beam to wiggle back and forth consistently about a 0.5 millimeter. And so we noticed that if we move the cylinder magnet up and down like this, the beam would move in and out. And if we move the cylinder magnet, back and forth like this, the beam would move right or up and down. So it seemed like the beam almost pushed itself away. Now, it could be magnetohydrodynamics, we thought. Maybe we're affecting the air and we're causing lensing because we're grabbing onto some free charges in the air and maybe, refracting it. But with the idea that you can use a magnetic field to curve a laser beam, this Faraday effect system, then it kind of offers the possibility that maybe there is an interaction with the trajectory of a laser in a divergent magnetic field, that maybe we could actually bend that. And it would lead to the question of, if we're not actually bending the beam itself, are we modifying some space-time coefficient that causes the beam to take a slightly different path, even though very, very small? Any thoughts on that would be really wonderful, because we're going to continue this experiment. And what we want to do next is get a mirrorless camera and take the CCD and use it as a detection mechanism to show and record very tiny changes in the position of the beam, and use an electromagnet so we don't have any interaction there, and we can effectively just show that if the beam's not touching the magnetic poles already, it's obviously not some kind of diffraction across the surface or reflection. That way we can eliminate out the variables and show that we really can affect the trajectory in a vacuum. So yeah, thoughts, if anybody has any. I guess we're going to keep on doing the experiments then, and we'll let you guys know. It's a weird thing, hey?
Well, thank you, Jeremiah. So let me go back to Ron. Let me mute you out, and then I'll mute. Let me see. I'll mute Paul. We'll just get it back to just Ron. Let me read a couple of comments here. One thing, Gary just mentioned this. I'm going through the comments. He said a UAP sighting with a witness wearing polarized sunglasses saw dark rings around an object, which may indicate Faraday rotation. Gary, do you want to ask?
Yeah, I guess if I had to frame it as a question, it would be, could this Faraday rotation be a result of gravitomagnetic effect versus what they thought at first, just a strong magnetic field? Have you looked at that, Ron, using picking up Faraday rings or a Faraday rotation effect in the polarization of light to measure gravitomagnetic fields?
I haven't, but I know there has been work done from starlight and things like that.
Right. Thank you.
Yeah, so you're on the right lines.
Okay, wonderful. And then, so Eric Hermanson had said, and again, I should apologize. I've got folks kind of coming in and out of the room as we speak, so lots of distractions. Eric Hermanson had talked about time dilation in the region, not a magnetic field. Eric, is that something you wanted to ask about?
Yes, I don't know that I'd really want to ask about it. I'm just suggesting that a different mechanism is at play.
Oh, okay. Okay. I'm sorry. I just wasn't sure. I'm trying to go through all the comments because I have a backlog. So
I just wanted to say thanks, Eric, for that. Yeah, we don't know what it is, and I don't really have a personal opinion about what it is. I'm just trying to figure out maybe what's going on and eliminate what it's not. And that would make sense. I didn't realize that you could affect just one parameter like that and still change the trajectory of a beam. But there's, I still have a lot more to learn yet. So I'm learning as I go here. Thank you very much for the info. I'll look into that.
I hope you're going to do the experiment.
Oh, absolutely. It's all down to the experiment. I mean, at the end of the day, I'm an engineer, not a physicist, and not a professor. So I'm definitely all about doing the experiments and seeing what happens, and then sharing those results.
I wish I was. Yeah.
I'm just trying to understand before I talk about what it is that we're looking at. What's
I've
that
got
there?
my cylinder and my piece of glass, and I've tried, but it needs, well, it really needs someone good at experiments, and I can see that you are.
Well, thank you. We can't wait to share our results with you guys. We'll be
Right.
doing that experiment over the course of the next month, and we'll have better measurement systems than we've ever had set up, so we can give true diffringement patterns and demonstrate what's going on. Nice.
Well, yeah, gentlemen, let me jump in real quick. So I think that we're all caught up on questions, and we have about half an hour until Nick Pope arrives. Do you want to just kind of go to an open, or actually there's Paul. So after there's Paul and Wayne. So the minute I mention it, questions pop up. I was gonna say, do you want to go to an open discussion? But let me go to Paul.
Let me ask two questions. When you talked about a lot of programmatic issues, when HOTL was coming around, was that taking away some of your funding?
Sorry, Paula, I do know you, but I couldn't quite hear the question.
When you were talking about programmatic issues, when
Right.
HOTL was around,
Who?
HOTL or HOTL
Oh,
was
yeah.
around,
Okay. Yeah,
did
yeah.
it suck up your funding?
No. No.
So it's two parallel programs then.
The Greenglow program was tiny, absolutely tiny. I don't know whether I should tell you on the thing. I mean, I started it really in 1986. It was finished in 2004. I doubt whether we spent £100,000.
Jeez.
Yes. Well, that's the UK for you. The NASA program cost, the NASA GPB program cost $750 million.
Hey, I don't get any of that.
No, maybe not. But,
The next question I have is can you give us some heads up about what inputs you got from Graham Innes?
From
Graham Innes.
Oh, Graham Innes. Not a lot.
Okay.
What happened was, have you heard of the Royal Aeronautical Society in the UK?
Yeah.
What's called the Royal Aeronautical. I got a call from him for me to meet him there in London, and I went down. That was my first time I'd met him, and he's certainly very talkative, and he knew a heck of a lot about what was on the web in this subject area. But I thought he was a UFO man, and the one thing I had to be careful of was not going back to where I worked at BAE and said I was working on UFOs. I'd have been sacked. For some reason or other, people are scared of UFOs.
Did you happen to look at Potter's design? Paul Potter's design?
Potter's design?
Paul Potter's design.
I don't know.
Okay, it's a copy of what Andreessen did about a UFO.
Right, I don't know it.
Okay, I was just curious.
Right, no, I don't know anything about it.
Thank you.
Okay, so let me go back to Wayne. Wayne.
Yeah, just two things. One I wanted to add regarding the laser deflection experiment was that I noticed a similar slight deflection in a beam when I put near it a rotating cylinder of bismuth powder in epoxy, and it seemed like that had some effect on the beam as well. But I need to do more experiments with that just to verify it. And second thing was I was hoping Eric could elaborate more on the time dilation concept and what that actually means in terms of space and deflecting the laser beam. Thanks.
Yes, I just sent the group message. It's not something that I can elaborate on in a short amount of time in a way that would do it justice, in that it's an assembly of my understandings from quite a few years now of looking into this and thinking about it. And so if you send me your email address, I will send you some of my ideas, and we can discuss it offline. And if Tim wants to talk to me about doing my own presentation, I'll certainly think about doing that.
Sure, absolutely. Yeah, let's talk about that, Eric, for, hopefully maybe the 30th or the next after that. Now, we also have some comments from Michael Richardson. Michael is having some trouble with his audio, and that's not something I can really assist him with right now. So, but he's saying that gravity is an entanglement, not a force. Time dilation is possible when time flows faster on one side of a photon. And again, these are things, hopefully we can have him back in the future to talk more about this, but he does have some comments in chat there, as well as Eric's, and we definitely want to follow up on that more. We should also welcome Nick Pope. I just saw him come in. And so do you guys want to do a few minutes do you want to take a kind of a short open session, or how should we do this?
Has Wayne seen that book, Tim?
Let me see, the Time Traveler by Ronald Mallett and Bruce Henderson.
Yeah.
Wonderful. Okay, and well, guys, why don't we do this then? Why don't let me see, I will pause recording, and why don't we take a short break?
1 second, I had a question.
Oh, okay.
Can you expand a little bit on the gravitomagnetic field? I saw you showed a picture of the Earth. Is this some sort of connection with the spin of the Earth, or are we talking about the gravitic field of the Earth, or the magnetic field of the Earth? What exactly are we working with here?
Is that over to me, Tim?
Yes.
Yeah.
Okay. Well, the Earth has got a magnetic field, and it's also got mass. So it's got a gravitomagnetic field. So the two go together. Now, if you're going to detect...
the spin of the Earth with respect to the sun's frame.
Right. If you're going to try...
Different frames of reference, there's the sun is spinning as well, and it has its plane, and then Earth has its plane of spin. And something that I found very interesting when I was looking at the gyroscopes with Tom Vallone and Mike Gamble is that they noticed that the best results were found when the gyroscopes were offset by 23 degrees, which is the offset of the Earth's axis. So I was wondering if there's a connection there, and if you can elaborate more on that.
If they are connected, there will be an effect. That's all I can say. If they are connected. If they're not connected, then you've got that permeability factor, 10 to the minus 26. So you can forget it. There's no effect. Don't forget that gravitomagnetism is equivalent to angular velocity. But whereas gravitomagnetism field can be experienced across space, you don't get any effect from angular velocity. The angular velocity of the Earth has no effect on anything except the gyro, of course, because you're fixed to the Earth. So it will affect the gyro. The gyro will be fixed in space, but because you're fixed to it, it will look to you like the gyro's moving. There is also a gravitomagnetic field there. It's too small to detect. The Russians had an experiment, or at the same time as NASA Gravity Probe B was starting, they wanted to do an experiment on Earth to try to detect the gravitomagnetic field. But you've got to be careful that relativity always comes in. If there's no relative movement, you won't see anything.
Right.
Can I jump in? Can I jump in with the angular velocity? With one thing on the angular velocity, if you think about a satellite in motion in a stable orbit, it has to travel an exact velocity, angular velocity, in order to stay in orbit without being pulled down to the Earth by the Earth's gravitational field. but really it's the gravitational time dilation, magnitude of time dilation at the satellite volume that's pulling it down toward the Earth. And so it's moving at a velocity tangent to the Earth at an angular velocity that creates a time dilation, a clock rate change that balances out the clock rate change that's imposed on it by the Earth's gravitational time dilation. And they equal each other. And I think that's where the time dilation comes into play. Thank you.
Is that Schuler? What's called Schuler something or other?
Also, one other thing I wanted to mention, we are working with gyroscopes, and we are also trying out Podklanov, both those experiments that you mentioned. So if you stick around in a couple hours, we're going to be showing our replications of it. I've already gone through several prototypes of the gyroscopic device, and I have it all on these little remote control, like RC remote control setup. So you can try any iteration you want with the control of your fingers. And it all comes down to programming at this point. What angles do we want? What movements? The first prototype, we had some mechanical difficulties because the gyros I got, the servos that I got were completely inadequate and the whole thing started falling apart after about a minute, and I was afraid the gyros would fall. By the way, the best gyroscopes are made in England. Sure you're familiar with that. You get them at gyroscope.com. They're expensive, but they're worth every penny. Precisely balanced, and we have a setup with 4 gyroscopes because Mike Gamble is just trying 2, and he noticed that it was a sort of a pulsing effect. So I was thinking, if you're having a pulsing effect and you're not able to get it, permanently linear, maybe you should have 4 gyroscopes. This way you can clean up your AC, your alternating pulse. And I think that's precisely what we're seeing. We just need to get the software figured out of, software being how to wiggle our fingers while we're trying this device. And it's actually right here beside me. Another experiment that we're working on is a spinning disc inside of a magnetic field. And there's reason to believe that might create some sort of gravity shielding effect. Although my power supply is having a little issue, I might just use a battery for it for the experiment later on today, just to pulse it with enough energy in order to get like some decent field, because all we were dealing with was around 90 Gauss, which is, not even a weak magnet puts out more than that. So there's a lot of experiments coming on. I think it's around 2 hours from now when we go live from the lab.
Yeah, and that'll be really exciting.
Yeah, well, so I've got one more question for directed at Ronald. In that slide where you show the Earth's precession and its magnetic field, and they're trying to measure the difference between the gravitomagnetic field perhaps of the Earth and the gravitomagnetic field of space itself, you mentioned that they're trying to use this reference frame in space to detect the precession of the Earth, although it's very small and we're looking for these tiny numbers. So I guess my question would be this: is the Earth's rotational axes of alignment and its position with the sun perhaps tied to some other external larger gravitic field that's coming from somewhere externally in space or from space itself at our local place in space? I'm just basically what I'm asking is why does Earth have its specific alignment, and why does it have its specific orientation and rotation around the sun, and why does that have its orientation to the rest of the galaxy? Is there some other larger galactic level field going on that our little solar system is coupled to?
I don't know. Good.
Sorry, didn't mean to ask a really far out there question, but I wonder if it's related though.
Could be. I don't know.
Sorry. Thank you though.
Okay.
If you talk about off the wall questions, I have a question. Does anybody have any information at all about the magnetic field about a UFO? We may have some measurements in terms of the electric field based upon a radio going off the air, but is there any magnetic field data on this subject?
Paul, the link I sent earlier in the chat box, which I can send again if you want, was the 1953 Yuma, Arizona sighting. And that was a famous sighting because a scientist made the sighting. His name was Wells Allen Webb, and he was wearing polarized sunglasses. And in his polarized sunglasses, he saw dark concentric rings around the object, meaning that there was, his take of it at the time was, it must have been an extraordinarily strong magnetic field around the craft to cause a significant enough polarization shift around the craft that the polarization rotation would cause so many concentric rings. I think he counted almost half a dozen concentric rings, which would be an impossibly strong magnetic field. But when I saw Ron's,
Okay, now these are on the outside.
On the outside of the craft.
This is on the outside of the vehicle.
Circulating around the sighting. But when I saw Ron Evans' presentation, go ahead.
I'd love to see the paper.
Yeah.
If you can send me the paper, I'd appreciate it.
Actually, let me put it back in the chat window right now because I was with us too, and Nick has probably seen vastly more UFO and UAP sighting data than any of us have. But this was collected by.
Let me ask you another question, Gary. Let me ask you another question. The implication there is that the glow in these rings are magnetic.
Well,
how would you say they weren't electrical?
Magnetically caused.
What if they were electrical?
Well, when I saw Ron Evans's paper, he was suggesting that Faraday rotation may also be a way to detect gravitomagnetic impact, which I had not thought of until I saw Ron's paper just now. And so it may very well have been these rings that he was attributing to a strong magnetic field may have been caused by a gravitomagnetic field generated by the craft. So it's an alternate explanation for these Faraday rings that I had not thought of before. So I thought that was an interesting angle that Ron brought up, that a Faraday rotation may be another way to detect gravitomagnetic fields.
So when I get a picture of a UFO and it's a bright glow, what you're telling me is that I should be able to get some information about the magnetic field.
Yes, you should be able to, if you have polarization detection, in other words, if you have two detectors pointed at it, one with the polarization oriented this way, the other with the polarization oriented the other way, 90 degrees, that if you compare those two and you look at the phase, you look at the polarization, if the polarization is shifting across the X or Y axis, that polarization shift may be from Faraday rotation, and that Faraday rotation may be able to tell you something about magnetic field strength.
But I don't get anything out of, let's say I have a picture that has an IR and an UV picture. Do I get any effects over there?
No, the problem is it's not. Yeah, you're not looking at it, not unless the data is polarized.
Okay.
You have two infrared detectors that are polarized in different ways. You can see it. The reason this scientist was able to see these rings at all was because his sunglasses were polarized. Otherwise, just a regular photo, you're not going to be able to see anything.
Well, Gary, that information is really very useful. And for Nick Pope, this is the type of stuff we're talking about. Little tidbits of information, that happen by chance that nobody would think about as important. But Gary just brought this up, and this is going to be very helpful. We should probably reach out to Stephen Greer and all those people who try to make contact with flying saucers all the time and ask them to try this experiment as well. Because like they get a close up and they can get some pictures of that. That will be very useful in the lab.
Certainly, if they had a polarization filter, that would be a fantastic tool to see these rings.
Those are.
Let me jump in really quick also. So we have some chats here. Mark Fiorentino, I'm not sure if Mark would want to jump in or not, but he did in chat, he said the Air Force used to bring magnetometers to UFO landing sites during Blue Book. Actually, I've heard that before as well, magnetometers being something people have tried to investigate those with. And then Sean Richter had talked about access to a Google Drive database. And he had said, email him at extraterrestrial.engineering@gmail.com. And Sean, maybe you could clarify what is in the database that people would email you for. But again, for YouTube listeners,
Well, Tim, let me ask you a question. Let me mention something. Okay, I might see it on the footprint after it's gone, but I'm more concerned about what it is on the vehicle itself in terms of its propulsion. Now, Bruce Cornett is on your list over here. He's taken lots of pictures. I'm just curious if Bruce has looked at anything with a polarized camera lens.
Bruce Cornett, right?
Yeah.
Let me ask him to unmute. Sir?
It looks frozen.
Oh. Yeah, he might be. Yeah, he might be frozen.
Okay.
Okay, there we go.
Is.
Hi, Paul.
How you doing?
Yeah, I just put something in chat on this. The data that I have is published in my 2019 book called Unconventional Aerial Phenomena in the Hudson and Walker River Valley of New York. You can get that on Amazon or on Kindle. What's important in those data is that I recorded all sorts of electromagnetic field effects on my time exposures that are quite interesting. The electromagnetic field rotates clockwise, counterclockwise, clockwise, counterclockwise as the craft is moving along. And take a look at this. There's a lot of important information in there that could help determine what works and what doesn't.
Do you mean to say that the entire field of the craft rotates clockwise then counterclockwise as if it's reversing, or do you mean that it has two simultaneous fields that are juxtaposed to each other happening?
I record the movement in the lights. These craft typically had navigation lights, headlights, and things like this. And these lights literally rotated and in one direction and then immediately in the opposite direction, back and forth and back and forth.
If I may ask, what was
while the craft did not rotate.
What's the time cycle at the speed that these things reverse?
Slow by comparison, because you can actually see, on my time exposures, determine the length of time and the number of loops. Might have had 2 or 3 dozen of these loops within a 20-second time exposure.
But Bruce, your ground observation site is fixed, right? So if you're seeing the variations of the field, it's at that fixed location, true?
What you're talking about, the Pine Bush location?
I'm talking about your measurement, your electromagnetic measurement. The craft is moving, but your measuring site is fixed, right? So you're picking up as the craft is moving in a location, true?
Correct. If you can hopefully hear me without my voice breaking up. I was followed home one evening from work by a Boeing 707 that had no insignias on it. It was totally black, no external engines, no windows. It crossed in front of me on the New York Thruway and then proceeded to cross the highway as I went home to Middletown, New York. When I got home, it was the sun had already set. I ran in, got my camera, set it up, and it came back and flew over me. It was what appeared to be a full size.
Bruce, you're breaking up pretty badly. Yeah, Bruce, you're breaking up pretty badly. I think we've
Wingspan of the of a Boeing 707.
Oh, okay. Okay, well, let's hold for now. I'm going to mute everybody back out, guys. So one thing I would just like to say. Let me see. We should all put our hands together and do a giant thank you for Ron. Mr. Evans, thank you so much for presenting. I wanted to get that out of the way because we are pushing right up against Nick Pope's time slot. But Ron, thank you again. It was a wonderful presentation, incredibly in depth, and thank you very much.
Tim, did you get the last part? I was cut off.
No, and so if you want to give it another try, if you could try to squeeze it in, we've got in just a minute here.
Okay. The images that I captured using the chopper device showed how fast the craft was, the Boeing 707 was moving, and it literally stopped and backed up. And I have that on film. All of that is on the internet. So
Oh, okay. Okay. Well, Bruce, you're breaking up again. So let me mute you back out. Okay. Oops. Yeah. It looks like Bruce looks like he's frozen. Okay. So Ron, thank you again. Let me mute you and I will go back to, let me see. Now let's go to Nick Pope, who is joining us. We've got about 2 minutes here. Okay, and Nick, are you with us?
Yes, I am. Hopefully you have good sound and vision, everyone.
Oh, it sounds wonderful. Thank you, sir.
Great.
Okay, well, so we've got about 2 minutes left. Should we take maybe a short break and then we'll come right back? Okay, well, let's do that then. So I'm going to pause recording for just about 2 minutes and then we'll be right back. And we'll do Nick's presentation. Okay.
Was that Gary who just spoke from New York?
sorry about that. Bad signal.
Oh, Bruce, yes. Where do you live in New York? Is this upstate or New York City?
Yes, Mark.
You're kind of cutting out. Maybe you should turn off your video so you can get just the audio. Bruce, we can't hear you.
I'm back. Can you hear me now?
Oh, we can hear you now.
Okay. But on the lights on that UAP Boeing 707 were spinning counterclockwise and it's doing it simultaneously as it flew over me.
And where was this? In upstate New York or like in the New York City area?
Yes, in Orange County. Yeah, north of New York City, near.
So the Hudson Valley area, right?
New York Thruway to my home in Middletown, New York, at sunset, and it's called. You can find that on my website. It's just you can find my email me. I'll put my email address in and I'll send the links for those who would like to.
Yeah, we'd definitely be very interested. Your audio is cutting out, so maybe just put the links in the chat box so we can check that out.
Yeah.
If you want to visit the lab, we are in Hawthorne, New Jersey, which is in northern New Jersey, like 15 minutes from the George Washington Bridge.
Okay, you were very close to where I was.
Okay. So let me do this, Mark. Let me mute everybody back out and we will go to Nick Pope now. And I should apologize for the delay. Let me resume recording. Okay, we are here. And Nick, now you have a presentation. Do you want to try and do a screen share on your side for that?
I confess to being such a technophobe that I'm not really sure how that would work. And I don't know what other people's preference is. I mean, I'm quite happy to do it without the presentation, but if you've got it to hand, you know, maybe just ask you to go to a particular number slide and flash it up for a while.
Sure. Or if you'd like, I can just put it up for you and run it.
Now, if it's put up, can that be done in a sort of split screen way where people can see a bit of me and the slides too?
That I'm not sure about. Well, why don't you just begin and just let me know if you want me to put it up.
Certainly. Well, I will jump straight in then. And first of all, I should make a little, first of all, welcome everyone. And thank you very much for turning up. I see on top of the screen a small but very distinguished group of people whose names I recognize from various open and closed lists on this subject. So I think there are some very interesting players here today. Welcome. I'm actually speaking to you from Tucson in the great state of Arizona. I've lived in the US since 2012, so I'm not actually in the UK. So with that out of the way, first of all, a disclaimer and an excuse. I am not a scientist. I am a former civilian employee of the British government at the Ministry of Defense. So the science parts of a lot of this will go way over my head, I'm afraid. I know what I don't know. But what I am going to aim to do today, and I think I've got about an hour, and then throw it over to questions, but we'll see. What I'm going to aim to do today is maybe give a little overview of the UFO phenomenon, but with particular reference to some of the things going on over in the last 3 years here in the US Navy sightings, ATIP, ORSAP, Senate Intelligence Committee interest, those sorts of things. And what I'm going to try and do, a lot of you will be very familiar with the facts of this, but hopefully in telling the story, I will be able to contextualize it and give, I hope, a sort of insider's view on how government views this subject. And all you scientists may say, no, you're getting it completely wrong. And absolutely, that's your right. And we can get into that in the Q&A. But I will just tell you how I view this coming from a government background. Before I go on, how is the sound and vision doing on that? All good?
Yeah, Nick, you sound wonderful. Thank you.
Great.
Yeah.
Fabulous. Well, I will press on. And greetings to everyone, as I say. And I see, I caught the tail end, and greetings particularly to Ronald. I think you're going to be mentioned in this first little anecdote that I tell. Despite not being a scientist, I do have a sort of layperson's interest in advanced theoretical physics, exotic propulsion systems, etc. And I attended back in, gosh, I think it was January 2001, a sort of international field propulsion. Good, yes, you know the one, the International Field Propulsion Conference held at, I think it was University of Sussex in Brighton, organized by Ron Ennis, was it, I think? Graham Ennis. And Ronald was there, and Hal Puthoff was there, and 2 or 3 of the, I mean, maybe some other people here today were present, 2 or 3 of the people who authored some of the 38 papers produced under the ATIP/ORSAP contract were there as well. I'm not sure whether I'm supposed to name them even now, but I think for those that want, it's a very interesting thing. I looked the other day, actually. It's very hard to dig out the agenda for that field propulsion conference and the list of attendees, but I did find it. I think it is out there. There is quite an overlap, as I say, with the authorship of the 38 ATIP papers. So that's an interesting little part of this, a story that perhaps has not yet been told. And if anyone wants that, I'm sure I can track down again the hyperlinks to it. But my recollection was that there were, shall we say, an awful lot of people from not just the scientific community, but from government, military, and intelligence, all, and I'm including myself in this group, somewhat sheepishly looking down at our shoes and saying, oh, yes, I'm only here in a private capacity, you understand. And everyone nodding back and saying, oh, yes, me too, me too. So that particular field propulsion conference, I think, although it was now, 21 years ago, actually, this month, sowed some interesting seeds, some of which are germinating and still germinating today. So with that little anecdote out of the way, I'll jump straight in. I worked for the Ministry of Defence in the UK for 21 years. I'm a civilian employee. They move you around every 3 or 4 years on level transfer or hopefully promotion if you do well. And I did, I think, 5, 6, 7 different jobs, including some secondments in the course of all this. I'm best known for a posting that I held between 1991 and 1994, when I was assigned to a Ministry of Defence division called Secretariat Air Staff. And obviously that's meaningless to people outside of the system. So in colloquial, does what it says on the tin terms, when I talk about this and when the media talk about this, they tend to use phrases like UFO desk, UFO program, UFO project. But suffice to say, part of my job was to research and investigate the UFO phenomenon, not because we had any corporate belief in extraterrestrial life, but simply as part and parcel of the need and desire to know about anything going on in the United Kingdom's air defense region. Now, this was a program that, a portfolio, whatever you want to call it, that goes back, frankly, to the Second World War and the reports of the so-called Foo Fighters, post-World War II, the ghost rocket sightings from Scandinavia, the flying saucer sightings, morphing into the modern UFO phenomenon as we describe it today. And a lot of this, the MOD looked at this on an ad hoc basis when it had sightings, particularly from its own people, pilots, radar operators. But formally doing this, kind of sort of trying to constitute it into a formal body of work with a methodology, etc., really goes back to 1953. And we had, I mean, there's not sufficient time to go into the history of this, and the history of this is quite dry, but it's in true British civil service fashion. It's littered with marvelous sounding committee names, such as the Flying Saucer Working Party, where and some of the great pioneers of the early days, like R.V. Jones, had a role in this sort of work. But from 1953 onward, this was formally constituted, and I was fortunate enough to be parachuted into this position in 1991, not because I had any interest or knowledge or belief of this, but simply good old-fashioned British civil service practice. It was luck. I happened to be due for a move at the precise moment that this vacancy had cropped up. I had worked with the manager before when I was seconded into the Air Force operations room of the Joint Operations Center during the first Gulf War, the Persian Gulf War. So I'd worked for this person before, and he said, look, I know you're looking for a move. I've got a vacancy coming up. Do you want the job? And I said, yes, please. What is it? And he said, well, amongst other things, UFOs. So that's what I did. And as I mentioned, I'm not a scientist. I was responsible for the handling of this topic for the ministry. So when defense ministers, whether it was the Secretary of Defense or the junior ministers, as we called them, which I always think is sort of a misnomer, we were quaking in our boots if ever we saw a junior minister and had to brief them, which was pretty scary. So I was responsible for drafting the advice that would go up to defense ministers. I was responsible for doing the investigations, whether they came from the public or our own people, whoever. I was responsible for handling the public correspondence on this, drafting responses to any questions asked in Parliament, which again would have to be formally answered, of course, by Secretary of Defense or the other defense ministers. And I also had to draft the lines that the press office would use when we got media inquiries about all this. So
now, Nick, I'm sorry. Let me do a screen share and put your slideshow up.
Oh, okay.
And Mark is telling me that it will show you at the same time. So let me do that. I should apologize for interrupting you, sir.
No problem. Okay. Now, can I advance those slides or?
No, actually you can't, but if you say next.
Oh, okay. Well, let's go from here. And in case anyone thinks that's a typo, next, please. Us Brits spell it with a C. So there you go. Next, please. And that's, oh gosh, me with black hair. That's one of the few surviving pictures of me actually in the office where we did this. And interesting little story about this, particularly with that story in the news, what was it, yesterday, about the guy who turned up at the White House with his briefing notes. Just to let you know, this is an official photo. No personal cameras are allowed in Ministry of Defense main building, headquarters on Whitehall. No personal cameras or photography at all, of course. That was a photograph posed for our house magazine called Focus, and our branch security officer had to be present at all times to check that nothing classified was out on the desk in sight to any of the people coming in to run this article and do this photo, and to check that nothing could be picked up in the background. So there you go. Is this working well for people, by the way, with the presentation and me talking? Okay, all good. So let me just press on for a moment. I'll leave that slide up for a moment until I say next. So my job was to research and investigate all this, but I was ably assisted by the deep specialists who could tell me all the things I didn't know. So when I wanted radar advice, I could go to the Air Force experts on that. When I wanted scientific and technical advice, there were various people in the defense intelligence staff who could advise on that. And when I wanted imagery analysis on photos and videos, again, we had specialists both in the defense intelligence staff and in the wider intelligence community whose resources and capabilities we could call on for that. And just to give you a very quick headline, I suppose, conclusion of all that, and this is just broad brush figures, but essentially 80% of these sightings we could explain with a fairly high degree of confidence as misidentifications of ordinary objects or phenomena, all the usual ones: aircraft lights, meteors, fire lanterns, etc., etc. 15% probably insufficient data to make a firm assessment, 5% unexplained. Important to stress, as we always do, unexplained does not mean extraterrestrial spacecraft, but neither did we rule out that possibility. It simply means that after an investigation, we couldn't determine it. Could be something, could be nothing. Let's go to the next slide. One of the big issues in my time, but much more so in recent years, was the whole issue of secret prototype aircraft and drones. And of course, there's a, shall we say, a sort of gray area between that and the UFO phenomenon. And some people say that some of these UFOs are misperceived as black projects. Others say that governments sometimes talk up UFOs because they'd far rather the media speculate and the Russian and Chinese about UFOs and see stories about UFOs than see stories about cutting edge military technologies. But this is a real photograph of a real thing. It's Tyrannus, named after the Celtic god of thunder. A UAV, British, hurrah. And it's quite obviously, they're self-evidently playing to the flying saucer in a hangar meme at this event from the sort of official unveiling of a prototype of this. And bear in mind with all of this, of course, the stuff they show you is the stuff they want you to see. As I often say, it's a little bit like the magician waving the arm around with the magic wand, drawing your attention when arguably the interesting and important things are going on up the sleeve of the other hand behind his back. So this is the sort of stuff they're showing in a world where there are things out there flying, depending on which aviation journalist you talk to, sort of 5, 10, 15, 20 years ahead of time. You know, what else is out there? And Ronald will probably know, as will many people on this presentation, and some of the deep specialists who are here. Just as an example, I think it would stagger most people to know just how far back the roots of stealth. But next slide, please. FCAV. This is I put, sometimes when I go to UFO conferences, I put these sorts of things up. I put up the last slide, and I used to ask it as a quiz question. I said, what sci-fi movie does that come from? People were shouting out their guesses, and I said, no, actually, it's real, and it's British. But this one, Future Combat Air Vehicle, was to have been an Anglo-French program. This and the previous photograph, the Ministry of Defense website and the public-facing bit. I'm not a whistleblower of any kind. This is a completely unclassified presentation, and any material that I show is taken from public-facing websites and is completely unclassified. But this is a sort of example of what they're putting out there for people to see. This was to have been, as I say, an Anglo-French program. I think it has been scrapped and superseded by other things now, but and this is an artist's impression, of course, but it's just to give you an idea of the sort of things that people are thinking about right now. And so that's why I say there's a blurry line, a thin line, a gray area between the UFO mystery and the sort of black programs area. Next slide, please. Well, let's get into, let's fast forward. We can go back to my Ministry of Defense time and the UFO work in Q&A if you'd like, but I think it's very important to bring this up to date and to contextualize, really, I suppose, the events of the last 3 years. Nobody on this list, and few people, I would say, in the wider public are unaware of this story, these 3 videos, and this is just a still. I don't have the video set up, but you've all seen them, I'm sure, and if not, they're out there freely available on the internet. The 3 videos that we have of US Navy jets, F-18 Super Hornets, encountering something. And the New York Times put this on the front page on December 16th, 2017. So this and the associated story of the ATIP program, which we're going to get into a little, really, I think, has changed people's perceptions of the UFO phenomenon. And of course, we are just almost literally only days past the 3rd anniversary of that New York Times story, which was quickly followed by the Washington Post, Politico, CBS, NBC, ABC, Fox, CNN, everyone, basically. And this is not a political issue in that sense, though we will get into a little bit of some of the players a little later. But next slide, please. Associated, I hope you like my pun there, associated with the release of these Navy videos, and some of the pilots and weapons systems people and radar operators have gone on the record. David Fravor, for example, his famous quote where he says, "I don't know what it was, but I want to fly one." And one can hear the audio. There's audio on I think 2 of the 3 video clips. And when these highly trained, highly experienced alpha male and female pilots get overexcited about this, I mean, it's telling, I suppose, in and of itself. But associated with this was the revelation that despite years of denial, the Pentagon had a program. You see, over 3 years ago, if you'd been a journalist and you'd picked up the phone and spoken to someone at Department of Defense Public Affairs and asked about UFOs, you would have received the answer, nobody's interested and we don't have any programs looking into this. And then the New York Times broke this story that there was this program called ATIP, Advanced Aerospace Threat Identification Program. No mention of UFOs in the title. And as we'll see, there is a lot of debate about what they actually did. And even the Department of Defense itself has openly and verifiably flip-flopped on exactly what the role of ATIP was. Luis Elizondo, the career intelligence officer most normally associated with this program, has gone on the record and spoken about this. He was started off in the US Army, transferred over to the Defense Intelligence Agency, and then, like a lot of people, I don't know if any of you followed and remembered the government inquiry into the death of the British weapons scientist. Gosh, the name slips my memory for a moment. Anyway, the weapons scientist. When they did the government inquiry into that, one of the most difficult questions was the fundamental one. Well, who did he work for? And anything in the shadowy world of intelligence, it's not quite as simple a question as it might sound, because it's constant sort of secondments and special projects, deployments, etc. But anyway, next slide, please. A lot of the work of ATIP was put out into the private sector, and Bigelow Aerospace got most of this work. This is one of their logos. So again, a lot of conspiracy theories about precisely why this work was put out into the private sector. Some people saying, of course, it maybe makes congressional oversight a little bit more difficult. Maybe it makes Freedom of Information Act requests a little bit more difficult, because in addition to the exemptions covering various defense and intelligence matters, you can also deploy in parallel or in addition the exemption that applies to commercially proprietarial material and the activities of the private sector. But the contractual solicitation document is one of the few pieces of paperwork about ATIP that is actually out there. And again, I think George Knapp, who has been quite close to Robert Bigelow and some of the other players, has published that, and it's now been picked up by other media outlets. But the contractual solicitation documentation for this program is out there, so you can read, for example, the names of the contracting officer, et cetera. And I'm not going to get into the whole complicated business of how, with these sorts of fairly advanced technical intelligence programs, government keeps oversight of all of this and keeps the contractors on track, on time and on target, as we would say. But I think some people would say it's occasionally rather difficult, because I mean, we're talking about such a deep specialist world that arguably only half a dozen people in the world know a deep specialist enough to say push back if there's any, I don't know what you call it, contractual drift, so to speak. But let's press on. Next slide, please. Okay, those 3 videos we've seen, and I'm not going to quote people in the UFO community, interesting though many of them are. For these next few slides, I just want to exclusively quote the official statements that have come out of either US Navy or Department of Defense, just so that we get on all this on record. And I have no difficulty, all this presentation, Tim, you feel free to share this in perpetuity with anyone here, and anyone following this either now live or later on YouTube. I have no problem with this being put up, just to get it on the record. And this is these are the official statements that the US Navy, or some of the statements that they've given. And you'll notice that they talk about intrusions on a regular basis. And so it's important to say that all of this official interest in UFOs, or whatever terminology we use, is not because of 3 incidents. It's because of an ongoing series of incursions into restricted military airspace. And because of the time constraints, I'm not going to read these slides verbatim, but people can see them up there, and they can dip back into them afterwards. But notice in the quote that they gave to the Washington Post, their mention of the word intention. What intention implies a deliberation. I mean, it implies something over and above a phenomenon. It implies an intelligence, whether it's terrestrial or something else. So the important part of that quote to the Post, I think, was the word intention. And it's also important, I don't have a slide for this, but it's important in understanding how government and the military and the intelligence community view this phenomenon. A lot of people say, oh, this is all very negative. Everyone's talking up the threat. Well, yes, absolutely. In that community, threat is defined through an equation. And that equation is said to be capability times intent. In other words, whether there's a threat or not is a derivative of capability and intent. The data that we have on UFOs seems to imply an impressive capability. The intent remains unknown, as evidenced by that statement to the Post. And of course, in any equation, if one of the factors is unknown, you can't really solve it. So that's why we say we don't really know if there's a threat. But the government position tends to be, it's better to assume there's a threat and be relieved if one does not materialize, than have it the other way around and assume there's no threat and get caught out if one suddenly appears. So next slide, please. Here's another one. It's been a lot of as I mentioned, flip-flopping on what ATIP actually did. But Stephen Greenstreet at the New York Post managed to get this statement from a US Navy spokesperson, Joseph Gradisher, I believe. And it said, yes, ATIP did pursue research and investigation into unidentified aerial phenomena. Next slide, please. Oh, yeah, before we get into that, actually, if we could go back to the previous one. I just want to say a word or two about terminology. We in the Ministry of Defense did not invent the term UAP, unidentified aerial phenomena. It had been around for years and years. But in the early 90s, we began to adopt it, not for the media and the public, but in our internal policy discussions. And the British government has now disclosed, declassified and released about 60,000 pages of UFO documents, most of them not particularly interesting at all, some of them extremely interesting, and some of them previously at a fairly high classification. The most interesting documents are the policy discussions where you will see the term UAP used. And the reason we were using it was to try to reframe the debate about the phenomenon internally, not with the media and the public, as I say, but whether it was to get funding for studies into this or whether it was to get engagement, meaningful engagement from senior stakeholders, whether it's defense ministers, service chiefs, senior government scientists, whoever it might be. You won't get their engagement if you say to them, I'd like to talk to the boss about flying saucers or even UFOs. But if you reframe this as a defense and national security issue, or perhaps even as a science problem, you might get that engagement. And that's why we did it. And it's interesting, I think it was Joseph Gradisher, the US Navy spokesperson I mentioned a moment or two ago, who did say in one of his briefings, and that's a term, UAP, that we borrowed from the British government. So yeah, we did that. Next, please. I suppose this gets to the heart of the matter. I mean, what are we dealing with here? With those 3 Navy videos, which, by the way, originally there was some doubt about their provenance. One of them turned up years ago on the server of a German video company, then turned up on a popular UFO and conspiracy discussion forum above top secret. 2 of these videos were put out by a private group called the To the Stars Academy of Arts and Sciences, headed up by Tom DeLonge, but up until a few weeks ago with some other interesting people like Luis Elizondo, Christopher Mellon, Steve Justice attached to it too. It took some while, but eventually the Department of Defense put these 3 videos up on its website themselves and issued a press release. I think it was April 27th, 2020, it was, I believe, where DOD finally put the 3 videos up themselves and said, just to clear up the confusion, yes, these are US Navy videos, and yes, the phenomenon characterized therein remain characterized as unidentified. And in a little, I suppose, dig at some of the people involved, they referred to the previous releases as having been unauthorized, quote unquote. But the 3 videos are now up on US government websites with an admission that they are genuine. So there's no doubt about that. So look, what are we dealing with here? Skeptics will tell you it's the first option, combination of misperception, radar anomalies, forward-looking infrared camera anomalies, etc. Let me fast forward. I'll come back to the second option, but some people say, well, it's just terrestrial tech. Maybe it's our own tech being blind tested on the fleet. And these blind tests are the only way to see how people will respond, radar operators, pilots. It's the only way to see how they'll respond in real world scenarios. You can't tell someone, we're going to be testing our new toys. They're quite stealthy, so look carefully. And that's no good. You've just got to run it as a blind test and see, are we going to detect it at all? If we do, are we going to assess it as a solid return that you need to take action on, or are you going to write it off as a glitch? If you decide to take action, what action? Are you scrambling jets? How quickly can they get there? Et cetera, et cetera. So one of the theories is that this is just a different part, left hand, right hand. And my goodness, of course, with all these highly classified, deeply compartmentalized programs, there's an awful lot of left hand, right hand, and people working in silos, and rightly so. I mean, on those sorts of programs. So could it be our own tech? Could it be Russia or China? Could it be non-state actor? And by that, I mean, I suppose people like Elon Musk or Yuri Milner or Richard Branson or whoever. Let me go back to the second option I put up there. I don't want to go into too much detail about this, but it has crossed some people's minds that much of what's gone on in the last 3 years could be some sort of intelligence operation. Very often in the intelligence world, you try to hide a capability you have, but sometimes conversely, you try to talk up a capability you don't have, or you try to sow confusion or tie up resources. And one of the least talked about theories of all this is that this is a narrative that has somehow been put together to, I suppose, try and bring about a certain outcome. Because make no mistake about it, in Russia and China and elsewhere, people in leadership positions will be turning to their subject matter experts and saying, what the heck's going on with the US at the moment with all this UFO stuff? So that's another option. And the sixth option, of course, is that it's something else, possibly something extraterrestrial, but all sorts of people have their own theories, time travelers from the future, interdimensional intrusion, demonic manifestation, or something that we simply can't characterize, something that we have maybe neither the language nor the conceptual awareness at the moment to understand, let alone put into words. As Sir Martin Rees, the Astronomer Royal, I think, once said, and I'm probably misquoting him, hopefully I'm not misattributing it, but he said, well, some of these concepts, it might be like trying to explain quantum physics to chimpanzees. So maybe some of this is something we can't even understand. Next slide, please. Here's another US Navy. Oh yes, I've done that one. That's they put that up on their April 27th, 2020 press announcement, confirming that the position is still unidentified. Next, please. That is a long-winded way of saying unidentified, and we're not going to speculate about all this. Next slide, please. This is an important one, I think. this is where hopefully my knowledge of the system will help people get a handle on this. It's one thing to say, I don't know, but we know, as I'll get on in a moment to explain, there have been congressional briefings on this. You don't go into a congressional briefing and simply say, Senator, I don't know, and pack up your notes and walk out of it again, because someone's going to stop you and say, well, wait a minute, you may not know, but what is, and there's the phrase that certainly in the UK we used to use, probably widely used, but you get the concept. Somewhere in the system, there's going to be a best current assessment. And probably what they will do is they will run through the 6 or so theories about all this that I put up in the previous slide, and they will assign to them a probability. And years ago, the CIA, you can find it on the CIA library website somewhere. A very famous paper called something like estimative probability. And this arose out of CIA people giving classified briefings where they used loose language like likely or probable or possible. Oh, it's possible that the Viet Cong have this. It's probable that this is an airstrip in the jungle. And of course, the people getting the briefing, a lot of them came out of the brief with different interpretations of what had been said. Oh, but he said it was possible this was an airstrip. Or, well, he said it was probable that this was, something or the other. And we will not go political with this, but I'm sure I don't have to remind you in more recent years about the debate on whether Saddam Hussein had weapons of mass destruction, where the position of the British government was that the intelligence was, quote, sporadic and patchy, unquote. But the politicians taking that raw intelligence either misunderstood it and or misrepresented it into a certainty. But that's a different presentation and not one that I will ever give. So somewhere in the system, there is a best current assessment of those 3 videos and the phenomenon more generally. And interestingly, there's a new media outlet called The Debrief, which has, shall I put it, some close ties with some of the people involved with this. And very interesting article ran just before Christmas. Well, I think it was December 2nd or 3rd, something like that. And clearly some people involved with this let it be known that they had not ruled out the extraterrestrial hypothesis. So make of that what you will. But as I say, in the system somewhere, there'll be a best current assessment. When I followed up on that and I said to a DoD spokesperson, look, I get that you characterize this as unidentified, but do you have a best current assessment or something, the same thing under a different name? And if so, can you release it? Not only did they not release it, but they would neither confirm nor deny that they had a best current assessment. But believe me when I tell you, they do. Because that's just the way it works. Because somewhere the president, the senators will say, well, I tell you what, I'm going to put you on the spot. Next slide, please. One of the more interesting Freedom of Information Act requests on all of this said that, yes, in Office of Naval Intelligence, it was ascertained that they had certain briefing slides classified top secret and a video classified secret that may either be different versions of the 3 videos we've seen, either different longer versions perhaps. Every story has a beginning, a middle, and an end. Arguably, the videos that we've seen are just the middle. So they may be longer. It may be that there's more telemetry data up there. You see some things from the head-up display. Maybe there's more of that, or maybe it's different. And interesting to note that the original classification authority is Naval Air Systems Command. Next slide, please. Oh, yes, this is interesting, I think. Shortly after the New York Times broke this story, obviously a whole bunch of people in Congress said, hey, what's going on? You always told us no one was doing UFOs, no one was investigating, and now we read this. What's happening? So you will find, again, one of the very few pieces of paperwork that we have on ATIP. I mentioned the congressional, the contractual solicitation document. We have that. We have a 2009 letter from former Senate Majority Leader who's instrumental in setting up ATIP to the Deputy Defense Secretary, arguing that ATIP should be given special access program status. And one of the other things we have is this January 9th, 2018 letter. And again, I have copies of this if anyone wants to email me offline afterwards. And I can give you the hyperlinks on government websites, et cetera, et cetera. They wrote to Congress, to specifically Armed Services Committee, Intelligence Committee, Appropriations Committee. And this quote was in there. The purpose of ATIP was to investigate foreign advanced aerospace weapon threats from the present out to the next 40 years. In other words, they were definitely trying to spin this as being an aerospace program. Next generation threats. Next slide, please. But that was the cover letter. Attached to the cover letter was a list of 38 studies. And as I mentioned, some of the authors of those studies were at the Field Propulsion Conference that Ronald and myself and others, maybe others in this room, certainly I'm sure others listening to this presentation attended. Some of those 38 studies were written by some of those same attendees. And guess how many of those 38 studies done under the ATIP contract had anything to do with Russian aircraft, Chinese factory capacity, North Korean or Iranian political intentions? Zero. They were all, as you know, about advanced theoretical physics concepts, anti-gravity, invisibility cloaking, stargates, warp drive, wormholes, and much more besides. A lot of it configured on the sorts of theoretical physics you would need to turn into an engineering reality. And my father was an aeronautical engineer by trade, went on to be deputy science advisor at the MOD, or chief scientific advisor, as they called it at the time. And my father would have loved this, but he would have said, that's all very well, but someone needs to build this. And by someone, he meant the aeronautical engineers. So, but you will see the list of these programs, and none of them, as I say, were anything to do with Russia or China and their aircraft, missile, or drone programs and what those might look like 40 years from now. It was all about deep space travel and the physics you'd need to get there. And the absolute giveaway, of course, was that there was a paper on the Drake equation, the theoretical Drake equation, to be precise. And as pretty much everyone listening here knows, I mean, frankly, the only purpose, the only purpose of the Drake equation really is to estimate the number of communicable civilizations there might be in the Milky Way galaxy. And so I asked the DoD, I said, if this is really just about next generation aerospace threats, Russia, China, etc., why did part of this government funding program look at and produce a report on the Drake equation, the only purpose of which is to estimate number of civilizations there might be out there? And let's just say that I believe last Wednesday was the 1-year anniversary of my question to DoD, which remains, I believe, one of the longest unanswered questions to public affairs in history. Next, please. I mentioned that there'd been some congressional briefings, Armed Services Committee, Senate Intelligence Committee. This is a phrase from somebody who took the brief. Yes, we've been briefed, but it's classified. I'm not getting into it. Next, please. Again, a very similar program, a very similar comment from Vice Chair of Senate Intelligence Committee. Yeah, I'm not getting into it. It's classified. Next, please. The president has been briefed too. He confirmed that he attended a short meeting on all this. In the first of his quotes that I put up there, he did say that, yeah, some of them really see things that are a little bit different than in the past. We're watching and you'll be the first to know. Probably not. He's given some other comments since then, very intriguing, teasing Father's Day interview with his son that he did, where he said he knows some interesting things, but he'd have to think long and hard about declassifying any of it. He commented on the Navy videos again, or one of them. He said that's a heck of a video, and who knows, maybe it's real. If he does have something, if he does know some greater truth about this, well, I guess he's only got a few days to reveal it. I suppose it would be the ultimate legacy cementing revelation. My people of the world, you know, my fellow Americans, my people of the world, we're not alone. The ultimate monkey wrench, perhaps, for the incoming administration too. All speculation, but we'll find out soon enough. Next, please. I'm conscious we've got about 5 minutes left and then questions. So I'm going to, this is the last couple of slides, and then we'll throw this open. And my apologies, I have seen some questions and comments come up in the group chat, but I can only just about single task. I certainly can't multitask. So apologies if I haven't gotten to them or let alone replied, but hopefully we can pick them up in Q&A. This again is a still, it's not a video, but I have, I suppose, been one of the regular contributors on this story as it has unfolded. I think I've done 12 interviews with Tucker Carlson, some other ones on other shows. As I mentioned, it's not a political issue. Long before Tucker Carlson was interested in this, Larry King was interested and covered it a lot on CNN, and I was a fairly regular guest on that show too. So let's not bring partisan politics into any of this. But I've done my best. I've done my best as somebody who now works as a broadcaster and journalist myself, I've done my best to keep this story in the public eye, to try to sort out some of the signal from the noise, to try to tell the story in a way that lay people will find interesting, and to try and keep it in the mainstream media spotlight. Next slide, please. This, I think, gets to the heart, and this is the last one apart from the wrap-up slide. This, I think, gets to the heart of where we are now. Last year, when the Senate Intelligence Committee drafted the Intelligence Authorization Act for fiscal year 2021, on pages 11 and 12, there was a section under the heading Advanced Aerial Threats. And it went on to mention UAP again. And it essentially said, within 180 days of enactment, we, the Senate Intelligence Committee, but also speaking for the Armed Services Committee, but someone has to take the lead, we want a report on this phenomenon from Director of National Intelligence, consulting Secretary of Defense and other agency heads and subject matter experts as required. This report must be unclassified, but can have a classified annex. And as I say, it's due within 180 days of enactment. Well, things got quite interesting. The Intelligence Authorization Act wasn't going to get through. Then the material on UAP got moved into the National Defense Authorization Act. That wasn't going to get through. And you'll recall the controversy about military bases being named after Confederate figures, for example, but that wasn't going to get through. And eventually, what happened was the Intelligence Authorization Act did get through by virtue of being tagged onto the COVID-19 relief bill, which was enacted on December 27th. So, and the version that was published did not contain the UAP material, but it was formally linked to it by virtue of a congressional note. So a lot of people have said, well, is it legally binding? Is it going to happen? This is a defense, this is a Director of National Intelligence lead. 2 weeks ago, I reached out to Office of DNI, Public Affairs, and I put this to them. And I said, are you aware of it? And are you going to do it? And the answer was yes. So this will be happening. 180 days, I think, from December 27th is going to be June 25th. Some people have speculated they might ask for an extension. I wonder whether they might actually come in early with something fairly bland, all the good stuff in the classified annex, of course, but we'll get to that when we get to it. Kamala Harris sits on the Intelligence Committee, so that's quite interesting as the Vice President-elect. One assumes, will have already been one of the people given this classified briefing. If not, she can very quickly get it. The Senate Intelligence Committee said that this report should also sweep up investigations being done by the FBI into some sightings on the continental United States. It must address all sorts of material, SIGINT, HUMINT. I heard somebody ask, I think at the tail end of Ronald's presentation, about data on all this. MASINT is a big part of all this, measurement and signature intelligence. And the government will have a lot of data. So they will have a lot of material on which to draw up a best current assessment. So I hope this short presentation has been interesting to you all in terms of where we are and perhaps a little bit of how we got here, and how those of us who look at this from within government from a non-scientific but from a sort of policy side of view, how we view this. So my thanks to Tim for organizing this event and to all of you for listening, and I would be more than pleased to take any questions. Thank you very much.
Okay, wonderful, wonderful. Well, Nick, thank you so much. I know we have a ton of questions. And again, when I have screen share going, I can't look into chat to view any of them. I should apologize. I'm getting a little bit used to using PowerPoint with Zoom. So that's my shortcoming. But let me see who, well, Gary Stevenson had his hand open. Gary, would you like to go?
Fantastic briefing. Thanks so much, Nick. I have three questions I put in the chat. First is your reaction, if any, to Frank Milburn's report that was recently released. I think looks to me like he's even in attendance today, so he might also be intrigued by your reaction to that. Second would be your reactions to Hal Puthoff's ATIP Reveal talk, which came out in June of 2018. Third, reaction, if any, to the Estes Park Advanced Propulsion Conference. I'd be interested in your thoughts on those three.
Well, with apologies, I think I missed the first, but if Frank's here, we'll hand the floor to.
That was the first one, right?
Yeah.
What's your reaction? Have you read the Milburn report, and what's your reaction?
No, I have not read it. I know I should have done, I'm sure. I tend to think that there are so many deep specialists with the science in all this that a lot will go over my head. But we can come back to that. I did. Now, Hal Puthoff's talk and presentation, was that an SCU event?
It may have been. I don't know.
Was it at Huntingdon or?
I don't know what the source was, and when it was put up on YouTube, it wasn't well sourced.
Right. I think that might have been a Scientific Coalition on Ufology talk done at either Huntsville or Huntingdon, something like that. I did listen and read to that, and the third one I did not. This was the advanced propulsion one, right?
I think Tim Ventura has a link that we could get to that one. But that's more technical. I think the nice thing about the Milburn report, which I believe Frank has like a 2-hour walkthrough on YouTube. I don't have a link to that, but that also was a very fantastic watch because it really brought it to life, in terms of what's new in that report.
Well, why don't I do this then? Frank is here, so why don't I do ask to unmute? And if he's been here since actually the very beginning, so if he's in front of his computer listening still.
Yeah, hi guys. Is sound okay for everybody?
Wonderful. Thank you, Frank.
Great, sure. What are the questions? What would you like me to answer?
Well, really, because I don't believe that I have read your report, if you could just give a brief overview of it and just as much for me as anything else. Now, and I apologize. It may be that I have read it. I have read an awful lot and seen a lot of presentations on this, and sometimes I just, with apologies, I just forget or I conflate somebody's presentation with somebody else's.
No, not a problem at all. I mean, my background, the way I came at it, I'm a former UK military intelligence officer. So I worked across the board with SF, with Royal Navy, Royal Air Force, Army. So I was really interested in the threat aspect of it, coming from that background. And I got in contact with people so like Jack Sarfati for the kind of technical background, Eric Davis, and also John Alexander, seeing as he had very extensive background in the Pentagon and obviously the requisite military background. So my paper really was trying, the purpose behind the paper, the kind of mission statement, I guess, was to bring where we are kind of with UAP at the moment and the more recent revelations of the last 3 years. It was to bring that into the academic world and especially into the kind of like the war studies, strategic studies world where I've been published before, because I felt, well, these guys aren't looking at, and they should be. If you're talking about a post-quantum leap in technologies, when I was a young officer at Sandhurst, they were talking in the early 90s, they were talking about the revolution in military affairs. So if we're now looking at what Jack Sarfati calls T cubed, tic tac tech, and these DIA papers that are looking sort of 40 years into the future, effectively that's a post-quantum leap in military affairs, and that's what I wanted to look at. But also as well in the paper I wanted to look at some of the declassified reports like Condign, and I've got a question for you, Nick, on that as well. And I wanted to look at some of the literature looking at potential like UFO weaponry and technology going back to the 1960s. People who were credible NASA aeronautical engineers, people with those kind of backgrounds, and to look at the literature behind it and to touch on that and to bring that into the academic world, because I felt this is an area that nobody really had looked at. So that's basically it in a nutshell.
Well, firstly, my profuse apologies. Clearly, I absolutely should have read your paper, and I don't know how. I mean, maybe the good news is maybe I'll read it and say, oh yes, that one. Now, and hopefully, what I said. Now, I don't know whether my terminology is either out of date or whether now I live in the US, there's different terminology. But hopefully, you recognized what I was talking about: capability times intent, defining threat. Is that something that you used in your war studies?
Well, very much so. Yeah. I mean, when Lou Elizondo was kind of repeatedly talking about capability plus threat. I mean, that's all what you'd sort of call my stock in trade from my own background. You're looking at capabilities, intentions, combat effectiveness, organization, intentions, locations, all the rest of it. The thing that I find interesting is that it's very difficult to pin down what the intentions of these intelligences behind these craft may be, because first of all you've got to pin down, well, who are they or what are they? And it seems to me that there's a hell of a lot of different descriptions of different craft, maybe having very similar technology, but there's a hell of a lot of different descriptions of craft. And also there's a massive variation in terms of description of the occupants of those craft as well. So whether people say, oh yes, well, Space Brothers, they're here to help us, or other people say, well, they are aligned. Well, who's they? Because there seems to be a lot of different theys.
Yes, and of course, I think people like you and myself and Lou Elizondo and others, we probably upset what I would call the sort of new age spiritual side of the UFO community when we start talking about capability, intent, and threat. But as you were saying, that's simply hardwired into us as the way that we define all of this. But I want to pick up on one point which will tie in. You mentioned these sorts of look forwards. As you know, and you've probably read it, maybe you contributed it to even, I don't know, but the UK government, and specifically the Ministry of Defence, sponsors something called the Global Strategic Trends Program. And some of that is published. And the great thing about global strategic trends is, as you know, it's a look forward about 30 years on the basis that, generally speaking, 30 years is what most people will tell you is a reasonable length of time to make predictions before they start to, too many variables come in and they break down. So when the DoD said that ATIP was really just looking at next generation aerospace threats? Well, fortunately, we know from global strategic trends what a sort of next generation look forward into those sorts of technologies look like. And it doesn't look anything like ATIP.
I agree very much. In the paper, I actually quote a lot of previously unpublished correspondence by permission between so Jack Sarfati, Eric Davis, the whole load of other physicists and people with intelligence backgrounds and other backgrounds on this kind of email trail. And Eric Davis is very adamant. He's saying, well, yeah, we were basically, what happens if these intelligences behind these UFOs start to decide that they're going to be hostile. And he said, some of the cases, like in Brazil, Colares shutting down, the nuclear bases in the northern tier, causing problems for, the strategic assets. He said, well, that's not, friendly behavior. So he was very specifically saying, yes, we're looking at these technologies because we want to have this technology if Tic Tac has it. So not just for looking at, adversaries on the terrestrial sphere, shall we say.
Sure. And you mentioned Project Condign. I should just, before I take your question on Condign, which I hope I can answer, I should just, for those that don't know, in the 90s, the Ministry of Defense commissioned a study into UAP, which was supposed to be something not just, previously when we looked at this, it's just investigating on a case-by-case basis. The feeling was that we had never done a proper intelligence assessment of the phenomenon. We'd never really done any proper trend analysis. The feeling was that we needed something. It went through a number of different incarnations and plans, and by the time it got off the ground, I'd moved on. But for those not familiar, Project Condign is the colloquial name for a study and a report known as Unidentified Aerial Phenomena in the United Kingdom Air Defence Region. And I think it ended up going, frankly, it did some good work, but I think it like a lot of these highly classified, deeply compartmentalized programs, where one person plays a disproportionate role, it went up going down a little bit of a rabbit hole about an atmospheric plasma phenomenon. I think, as a layperson, it made the mistake of trying to explain one unidentified, misunderstood phenomenon in terms of another. But it is what it is, and it certainly talked about the possibility of deriving, the term that was used was novel military technologies, quote unquote, including things like directed energy weapons, RF weapons, and signature reduction, etc. And there is an interesting crossover, I think, between Project Condign's final report, some of the things that came out in the Propulsion conference I mentioned from 2001, and one or two of the things that have come up in the ATIP program. But those dots, I think, have yet to be fully joined. But if you have a question on Project Condign, I will do my best to answer.
Actually, Nick, let me jump in. Jeremy Reese has been patiently waiting, and he is doing the YouTube live stream. So, Jeremy, did you have a question, or was it from some of the YouTube folks?
It rings a bell, but you'll have to refresh my memory. Well, I think with all of this, joining the dots is the challenge, and it's certainly fascinating that Battelle comes up. Battelle came up the other day, actually. Somebody asked me, and I think this actually ties in with Project Condign. One of the things mentioned in Project Condign was RF weapons, directed energy weapons, etc. But also, I think, non-lethal weapons and opportunities there. Then I think there's a fascinating, I don't even know how to unpack this. John Burroughs, one of the witnesses to the infamous Rendlesham Forest incident, John made a Freedom of Information Act request, and he turned up a DSTL document from the UK, Defence Science and Technology Laboratories, or whatever they call themselves, that was inspired by a Battelle paper. And they got into, I think the paper was about plasma vortices and plasma guns. And I have a short paper on that from DSTL that I can pass to anyone that's interested in it. But yeah, the same names come up again and again. I mean, just as a complete aside, I happen to be reading at the moment the book about the links between 60s counterculture and the birth of the personal computing industry, what the Dormouse said. And who should I stumble across mentioned there but Jacques Vallée, which I was not expecting to find. But yeah, always these connections. Yes, I'm familiar with that one. Thank you.
Wonderful. Well, so let me see, and I should apologize for being behind on the questions. Robert O'Keefe, he had said that he has a question. Robert, are you there? There we go. Let me ask him to unmute.
There we go. Hey, Ned. Nice to meet you. I'm the founder and CEO of Tachyon Aerospace. We're based out of London. Work with the, I would involved with the ESA and the ISA and a bunch of other aerospace organisations. We was asked, we were guest speakers at an aerospace conference a couple of years ago with NASA. Sorry, hang on. Let me just stop that. Sorry about that. Incoming call. Yeah, we were asked to be guest speakers at an aerospace conference with NASA, Airbus, and a bunch of other well-known companies. And during dinner, we were sat talking with the people from NASA, and we talked, like, in the industry, when you say technology that we've got flying now is 20 years ahead. it is generally, like in the industry, known, but we're probably 30, 40 years ahead to what the public are made aware of. As of to the US slide talking about the Navy, do you not think that that's not a Magic Wand project where they're trying to create some disinformation to go out to the public, so the public are watching like the wrong hand while they're investigating like the real phenomena that's going on?
It could well be. And I think I mentioned that as the second of the theories, that this whole thing, or part of it, a large part of it, could indeed be an intelligence operation to distract people from something else, to perhaps imply the existence of a capability that doesn't exist. I think that, and I don't know if he's here, is it David Hambling wrote an interesting article, was it in Forbes recently, where he talked about laser plasmas and such like. You know, that's, I guess, something else to go into the pot. Then there's the whole idea of spoofing. And if we could spoof an air defense system, an entire air defense network, to think something's coming from one direction and then come in from the other. Obviously, the military examples are immense. And this, of course, goes back to, what was it called, Palladium and other programs like that. But if that was then, as you say, where are we now? And you're quite right. And I think it depends who you ask. Some people will tell you, will say, yeah, 40, 50 years. Some people say 15, 20. I think everyone's got their own opinion, and there's probably no one single answer. It probably depends on the very specific field. But thank you for that.
I think one of the important things, though, is one of the comments which was made by NASA was that in the industry today, if you are and this is interesting because of what we've got flying now, and like the unknown, like the UFO side as well, but what we've got flying now, NASA absolutely categorically state that if you are 10 years ahead, you're considered crazy. So this is relevant for all of us that work on like alternative technology and new physics and science. So the big players in the industry consider you crazy if you're 10 years ahead of currently what the public are aware of. If you're a year ahead, then you're still considered to be bleeding edge. But if you're only 3-4 months ahead of the technology, which taking into account that they're 30, 40 years ahead, and we play the game that if you're 3 months ahead, then they tend to be happy to look at what you're doing, knowing that you're not a threat to them as an industry. And they stated that it would be, and this was asked by one of our team members. I was a guest speaker at the conference, but one of our company members asked a question of the NASA representative about this, and they stated if you're 3 months ahead, then you're considered to be feasible. And he he talked himself into a bit of a situation.
Right.
So,
no, thank you for that. And by the way, just backpedaling to something I mentioned earlier, I think I got a little tongue-tied on a couple of things. The government weapons scientist that I was talking about was Dr. David Kelly. And I also mentioned the interface between Bigelow Aerospace and the DIA on the ATIP program. And I mean, the point that I was wanting to make, but I just, I think, stumbled my words. What I was looking for in terms of the interface between private sector and government is the contracting officer and the contracting officer's representative. And those are the two key figures in keeping all this on time and on target, and not allowing the contractor to go down any sort of personal hobby horses and rabbit holes and things. And I think it was James Latatsky, mangling my pronunciations again, I apologize, who was one of the key players there with ATIP. Again, it's in the paperwork, I believe, the contractual solicitation documentation. But thank you for that, Robert.
And thank you as well, Nick. So Eric Hermanson had asked, from an engineering perspective, he said he was wondering if you believe, if there's any certainty or certainly not, I think he's asking, if the US or UK is in possession of any kind of off-world engineered vehicle. Do you think that that's the case or not? And if so, I guess he was wondering about, is that something that could be used to engineer new technologies?
The short answer is I don't know. My best answer, so far as my time in the Ministry of Defense is concerned, is that we did not have any such materials, artifacts, or anything in the UK. I can't speak to the position of the US government with any inside knowledge at all. I can only, I suppose, pick up on the speculation that has arisen as a result of people talking about these so-called metamaterials. Now, whether, I mean, to me, this is where, well, I don't know if there are any chemists here today, but my one little piece of layperson science knowledge here is to say that in one sense, with X-ray diffraction and isotopic ratio analysis, those sorts of tests on any anomalous materials are so obvious and so almost high school or first year college kind of chemistry that it's inconceivable to me that they wouldn't have been run on pretty much day one of any serious look at any materials. So while my answer is that I don't know what the US government has on this, my comment is that if they do have something, a couple of tests will very quickly tell them in a completely binary yes-no way whether there's anything interesting or and unusual about this or not. And with that in mind, it does strike me as interesting that the US Army, and I think it was Materials Command, whatever they call themselves, entered into a CRADA, one of these collaborative research and development agreements with the To the Stars Academy on this. Why would they be entering into a CRADA? Well, you could say nothing much to lose, a lot to gain. Is it just classic low probability, high impact? Well, yes, except that you would have expected them to ask the questions and maybe at least satisfy themselves on something like isotopic ratio analysis before they even got to that stage. So it's the US Army CRADA with TTSA is one of the more interesting things, I think, in terms of the science of all this.
Wonderful. Thank you, Nick. And let me actually, Frank has had his hand up. So let me go back to Frank then. Sir?
Thanks very much. Nick, I wanted to get your take, please, on something out of Condyne. I actually mentioned it in my report. In Condyne, they reference the former Soviet Union, and they've got this Russian source, Sokolov, and he's saying, I quote, "We had 40 cases where pilots encountered UFOs, blah, blah, blah. Initially, they were commanded to chase, then shoot. When our pilots would engage, the UFO would speed up. Then it said that happened 3 times, twice the pilots died. After that, we told the pilots to observe and change course and get out. The pilots viewed UFOs as a definite threat." And then it goes on to say the military, that's the Soviet military, were interested in UFOs because if they could understand the technology behind them, then they could win the competition against prospective enemies. The point that I've got is, if you've got a DI, a Defense Intelligence 55 report that's talking about the Soviet Air Force, which is effectively the principal adversary to both the UK and the US. So if the Russians, the Soviets, if they're concerned about UFOs being a threat, would the Royal Air Force and the United States Air Force not consider UFOs to be a threat?
They should, but as you probably know better than anyone, Project Condign was kept on such close hold that I'm not sure this ever got briefed to the RAF more generally. Indeed, I think with some aspects of the study, when the intelligence officer who was doing it went to talk to some of the radar people, I think they said they misrepresented the position as we're just doing a study into radar anomalies and flight safety or something like that. So the number of people, I mean, the short answer to the question is no, they weren't briefed, but they should have been. But of course, it's the same. I think the reason why so many opportunities were missed in Project Condign was that there wasn't proper stakeholder identification and engagement. I mean, I've done a couple of studies where I was team leader and deputy team leader, nothing to do with UFOs, but I know the methodology of an MOD study. One of the first things you do is you identify all your stakeholders and all the subject matter experts, and you make sure you go and talk to them. None of this happened in Project Condign. So, I know why, of course. I mean, it's not the first time it happens. It happens all the time. It's just, I would say, it's one of the more generic failures of specific intelligence community studies more generally. But it's incredibly frustrating.
Thank you very much for that.
Sorry, I'm still muted. Now, does anyone else have any questions for Nick? Or should I say who has a question next? Because there are so many that have been floating around. And now suddenly it's quiet.
Let me just interject on one point. I've seen a couple of people say that they want to get in touch with me. My website, my email address is contact@nickpope.net. That will get to me personally. So if anyone wants to reach out, whether it's for copies of any of the documents that I've mentioned, like the contractual solicitation or whatever it is, the Harry Reid letter. I mean, most of you have probably seen those anyway, but for those that haven't, I'll do my best. Obviously, I do get somewhat swamped with emails because that's a sort of email address on my public website, and I get a lot. So, but I will, if anyone wants to ask anything or request anything, contact@nickpope.net, and I will try to get back to you. It's a very busy time at the moment because there's a lot of stories I'm working on in relation to this, but I will do my best.
Wonderful. Okay, now let me see, Mark Fiorentino. Mark, did you have a question that you wanted to ask? It looks like he was asking about the government using disinformation tactics, but I'd like him to be able to ask it in person if I can.
Yeah, hello. Yeah, I was just wondering if you knew that, has the government tried to block us from realizing that magnetism has something to do with that anti-gravity and is the method of propulsion for their craft?
I don't know is the short answer to that. I mean, I think in relation to the UFO phenomenon more generally, the government, I would venture to say the government has seldom needed to use disinformation because frankly, there's so much kind of crazy stuff that gets tagged onto this subject that they haven't needed to. If ever you wanted to bury something amidst kind of crazy theories, there's no need for the government to put out crazy theories. Enough such theories are coming in all the time, and the government wouldn't need to. I think the one or two occasions where the government has literally, shall we say, stepped in to maybe throw gasoline on a particular fire has been the occasions where, for example, things like the SR-71 Blackbird and the U-2 were seen by pilots and maybe were going to get reported in such a way as it might have attracted the attention of the air attaché in the Soviet embassy, for example. And so in those circumstances, I think there was some sudden talking up of flying saucers and UFOs to try and bury that story or spin it. But in relation to magnetism, in relation to, I mean, I haven't really followed closely the whole business of these patents and things, but I know that there's a lot of speculation about that. No, I think, I don't know, but my gut instinct is government doesn't need to bother. Somebody else will do it for them.
Well, it certainly would be to their advantage, because whoever has the anti-gravity technology, gives that government strategic military advantage. And so I would think that they would want to keep that a mystery to the rest of us.
I would agree with you completely on that. And I think one sees that certainly in Project Condign, and they did not say that in the final report, but I think it is implicit. I mean, in some of the papers that we were exchanging before the thing got commissioned, there was one very succinct comment from somebody in the defense intelligence staff who simply said, we could use this technology if it exists. And as you say, there's no getting away from the fact that the nation, or maybe I should say now, or corporation on Earth that first acquires and or understands and replicates this technology, whatever its source, will be the dominant force on this planet for the foreseeable future, politically, economically, militarily, right across the board. And I think the search, the question of technology acquisition gets to the heart of UFO secrecy, much more than all the usual cliched things you hear about panic in the streets or undermining people's religious beliefs. No, I think it's technology acquisition. And if you imagine,
I agree.
If you imagine the United States, Russia, China, UK, India, Brazil, whoever, all sitting at a table, all playing poker, why would you show anyone your cards?
Exactly. Yeah, it's the world's most important secret.
Wonderful. Well, Mark, thank you. Now, let me go to Michael Richardson. Michael, your hand has been up for a while. Oops, and I think I just lost him. Okay, well, I suppose not. He kind of disappeared on me. Okay, does anyone else have any? Oh, wait, there he is. Let me do ask to unmute.
Hello.
Hi, Michael. Sorry about that. Go ahead, sir.
Okay, Nick, this is a very important question. Can you hear me?
Yes, I can.
Okay, I was witness to a UFO incident in the UK, which I'm sure you're familiar with one of the UFOs flying into a wind turbine, crashing into the wind turbine, and flying off with the turbine blade in the Midlands. Are you? Do you have any data on that?
I don't have any data on it. I'm familiar with the story. Now, it may be that there are a couple of such incidents, but I'm familiar of with one. I have to say I didn't think it was the Midlands. But maybe I have the location wrong. But I do remember the story ending up on the front page of the Sun newspaper under the rather amusing headline, "Close Encounters of the Turbine."
Very good. Yes. But
I don't have any data on it, I'm afraid.
Yes, we have some data on it. These 6 egg-shaped UFOs flew over my house about 6 weeks before they showed up and interacted with a wind turbine. The whole street could see these things. There is only about 400 feet up.
Right. And I forget the year of this.
It's about 10 years ago.
Okay.
All right.
Yeah,
but I believe there's a very serious message. Why would an intelligence decide to fly into a wind turbine? And I believe that is a message. But the other thing was, we noticed when they were flying over our house, they flew in a formation as the plow. And you could see the plow very bright in the sky. And so, maybe there's a message in their interaction with us. And I think that we should have another look at that.
Well, that's very interesting. And I'm grateful to you for sharing that. I mean, of course, the last thing you mentioned, also one sees in the film Close Encounters of the Third Kind. So it's a very obvious way, I suppose, to signal an intelligence. I mean, as to what any of this means, I think this is one of the understudied aspects of all of this, but it's also one of the areas where we constantly run into, and how could we not, the problem of our anthropocentric approach to this. And I always, in one sense, I always smile to myself when I hear somebody say, usually skeptics say, well, aliens wouldn't do that because, and then they go on, and I'm like, well, wait a minute, how would you know? And I think assigning a kind of purpose to a physical event using only the frame of reference of our own understanding is perhaps the biggest misunderstanding of all this. I know, for example, Ralph Blumenthal has a book coming out about John Mack. And John Mack, when he was talking about the abduction phenomenon, he made a very good point. He said, when people say that they recall being put on a table and having some sort of procedure, everyone says, oh, it must be a medical procedure. He said, but all we really can say is that if those recollections are accurate, and that's a big if itself, of course, it's like a medical procedure. It's the nearest thing our minds can fix on, but it may be something completely different. The same might apply. You mentioned the wind turbines. Somebody else earlier mentioned interactions with strategic assets and switching on or switching off of weaponry. You'll hear people in the UFO community say they're sending us a message or they're demonstrating their power. I think the honest answer is we don't know what they're doing.
But that is like to listen with your ears closed. You can see the message with your eyes. You can see the actions that they take. There's a serious message in all of their interactions with us. It's not just something that we take lightly. It's something that we should, convey a message back to them that we are listening and we understand. But, it's a very strange concept of communicating with an intelligence such as an alien intelligence.
Well, I think Dr. John Elliott at Leeds University has done some work into how one would communicate, as of course has the professor, I forget her name, who was one of the consultants on the movie Arrival. And this, of course, is, in Arrival, one of the best pieces of science fiction I think there is out there about this. The linguistic differences between, for example, conveying a tool or a weapon is very important. I once, this is completely off topic, and yet it's not. I once heard of some diplomatic talks in which the UK was involved, where the talks had kind of bogged down in the morning, and the chair of the UK delegation said, well, let's hope we have better luck after lunch. Let's go to lunch. We've got a nice restaurant lined up. Let's not talk business over dinner. The talks nearly broke down because that was perceived as an insult in the culture of the other nationality involved in those bilateral talks. It was misperceived as saying you may or may not discuss a particular topic. So if we can have these sorts of misunderstandings and miscommunications terrestrially, if we're dealing with extraterrestrials, what other miscommunications might arise? So
Absolutely.
That's why I say tread carefully in assigning meaning to this.
Now, Nick, so I want to thank you, and I worry that we're wearing you down, actually. So are you doing okay in terms of energy?
Yes, I probably have to go in the next 10 minutes or so, which will then break it down as being an hour's talk and an hour's Q&A. Would that be fine?
Oh, absolutely. Well, no, I can't thank you enough for joining us. And actually, I think everyone else here, I would just like to put my hands together for you giving this talk. I mean, this is absolutely amazing, you know, and to see you on the news and then have you present for this group is just tremendous. But yeah, I was actually hoping to wrap the questions up. If anyone else has any more for you.
No, feel free to wrap up. But if there are a couple of late ones, I'll try and squeeze them in.
So I think we have probably one more from Robert O'Keefe, and then that's it. Okay, Robert?
Just a simple one. There's a guy on YouTube called, I think it's Damien T. Berry, The Knowledge of Forever Time. I don't know whether any of you guys have ever watched his videos, but as of an explanation about UFOs and the messages that they're trying to convey and give to us, I think that his series of videos are really compelling. I just wondered whether you'd ever seen any of Damien T. Berry's work.
I'm afraid I haven't, but thank you for mentioning that. I will certainly do my best to check that out. Thank you.
Yeah, it's called The Knowledge of Forever Time because he puts a really good argument across for the way they're communicating right the way back through the beginning of history to modern day times. But he was actually killed. He was going to release one more video and then he sort of met with an untimely end. So we never got to see the final video.
Right.
Right.
Thank you.
Robert, thank you.
A lot.
Okay. Okay. Oops.
I did see somebody else says in there that they have a question. Mark Sokol.
Yes.
Okay.
Yeah, go ahead, Mark.
Quick question for Nick. How do you see disclosure coming out? By disclosure, I mean where the world generally accepts that extraterrestrials have been visiting us and flying saucers are real. How do you see that playing out? Timeline, and in which direction will it happen? Through technology or through major, government statements?
I don't think it's going to be a single event. I think many people in the UFO community think that there's going to be a sort of presidential announcement, my fellow Americans, people of the world, we're not alone. I don't think it's going to be that. I've heard some people argue with a degree of, I think, conviction here that we, in a sense, disclosure is not an event, It's a process, and we're in it. And by that, they mean that some of the events of the last 3 years have undoubtedly moved the dial forward. But unless we literally do have a spaceship in a hangar somewhere, and unless one day those hangar doors are opened for all to see, I think we will be in a situation where we won't ever say, in a sense, that we've crossed the line, because everyone has their own, I suppose, level, their evidence bar, so to speak. One person's evidence is another person's definitive proof. And some people say, you know what, we're over the line already. What more do you want? And others say, well, we'll never get there, because these days anything can be faked. So I don't, unless there is a spaceship in a hangar and it's rolled out, I don't think we'll have a single event. I think the next big thing that's scheduled, I mean, of course, a lot of unscheduled things. If I can make one prediction, it will be that something unexpected will happen between now and June. But the one thing we know is coming is this report to the Intelligence Committee and the Armed Services Committee from DNI. So that's something to watch. Aside from that, though, frankly, I think the answer might come more from science than from the UFO community. In other words, I think it would be something absolutely undeniable. And of course, I like those movies like Contact, of course, one of my favorite movies. I can't help but think that if ever we get definitive, absolutely definitive proof of the existence of an extraterrestrial civilization, it's more likely to come first through radio telescopes and picking up a signal, a message, downloading information, hopefully translating it. More likely come that way than a UFO event or a disclosure. So I would say the current, but particularly the next generation of radio telescopes, square kilometer array if the thing gets built, but some others too, that will probably be how we get the answer. But I would love to be proved wrong. I would love to be proved wrong. And you know what? Whatever you think of him, I would love for the last thing President Trump does before he leaves is to say, oh, and by the way, one more thing, there's aliens.
Wonderful. Well, Nick, on that note, thank you. Thank you again. So again, I think everyone, let's put our hands together for Nick. And
Tim, I didn't finish.
Okay.
One more second. Another thing about the Drake equation that you were talking about earlier, there's one thing that I think is missing that from the Drake equation that is a pretty binary answer to whether aliens are here or not, and that is whether it is feasible to travel faster than light. Any comments on that?
Well, there are probably, I suspect that almost everyone else in this room is better placed than I to answer that. I mean, I guess light speed, one could say maybe there's a workaround, maybe some of the wormhole and warp drive things. I mean, one thing as a layperson that I do always point out is that when skeptics say this runs counter to the laws of physics, I say, well, no, what you're actually meaning to say is runs counter to the laws of physics as currently understood. And of course, throughout human history, our understanding of the laws of physics progresses and changes. And so it may well be that there are workarounds. But, with my skeptical hat on, let's just suppose there isn't a workaround. Let's just suppose that we are stuck with sublight, and one could argue, even if we don't get, set aside matter, antimatter annihilation and nuclear fission, propulsion, set aside any ideas of getting to a sort of, I don't know, 0.3, 0.4, whatever it is of light. let's suppose we don't ever get any better than we can do now. Let's suppose, and I think it's unlikely, but let's suppose kind of Voyager and Pioneer speeds are as good as it gets for anyone out there, not just us. And it would take, what, 75,000 years at that speed to get from here to Proxima Centauri. In a universe 14 billion years old, if there were civilizations out there with a few million, a billion years head start, even at Pioneer and Voyager speeds with probes, maybe the self-replicating probes that were mentioned earlier, maybe post-biological intelligence, maybe that evolves, but maybe no one can get over a Voyager or a Pioneer speed. So what? The galaxy would be full of these things by now.
Right. And one other thing I wanted to say, you mentioned SETI, or the Search for Extraterrestrial Intelligence, using those big antennas. If you look at our own evolution, it doesn't make any sense that we would be able to contact extraterrestrials using that technology, because the type of waves that can propagate through space long distance are very large waves that carry very little information, which we no longer use. We're going from 1G to 2G to 3G, now to 5G, which are smaller and smaller waves with less and less penetration distance. So it's logical to assume that if there was other, civilizations out there, they would be going in that same direction toward the microwave band for higher bandwidth, and possibly toward what they call spooky action at a distance, or quantum entanglement. You're able to entangle two particles together that will communicate through time and space instantaneously across the entire universe. If you could have basically a walkie-talkie and talk to home base 100,000 light years away instantly.
Well, that's interesting, because of course it depends. I guess with SETI, the question is, what are other civilizations trying to do? Are they listening, or are they trying to make contact? And if anyone is trying to make contact or give us a sort of Timothy Ferris galactic internet, then one might say, even though the technology evolves, they would have knowledge to know that you need to aim the message at the listener, and at the level and type of technology that the listener would have. And that's interesting, because it plays into a wider debate, I suppose, about the nature of altruism and how widespread altruism is in the universe, and whether other civilizations would basically be taking the load themselves or making us do the work. But I think that's probably a conversation for a different day. But right. Yeah, it's a great point and a fascinating part of all this. Thank you.
Absolutely. Okay, well, so let me see. I'm going to mute Mark out for just a moment. Nick, I want to thank you again so much for your time. And so let's wrap everything up for Nick now. And again, let's give him a giant hand. I know we did a minute ago, but again, thank you. It is a true honor and a pleasure for you to join us.
Well, thank you, Tim. Thank you, Tim, for organizing. Thank you, everyone else, for listening, whether you're listening live or later on YouTube. And I apologize because of other commitments. I am not able to live kind of follow what went before or after, but I promise I will dip into the YouTube presentations. And even though I don't have the scientific knowledge, I am sure I will find a lot of interesting things once this is all posted up there. So thank you very much, Tim, and thank you everybody else.
Well, and thank you as well.
Bye now.